Hey there and welcome back. If you are already lying down, already warm, already letting the day come loose from you a little at a time, then you are exactly where you ought to be, and there is nothing else you need to do tonight but stay there and listen. This is going to be a long, slow, gentle evening, and the life we are going to spend it inside is one of the strangest and most stubborn any English woman ever lived. It is for anyone who has ever felt the pull of something they could not explain to the people who loved them. Tonight, I am going to take you into the drawing rooms and gardens and sick rooms of a woman born into more comfort than almost anyone in England, a girl with two great houses and a wide open future, and every door in society standing open to her who wanted none of it, and who spent the first 30 years of her life quietly at war with her own mother over it. You do not have to hold on to any of the names. You can let the whole of it drift over you and take you down. And late in this evening we are going to be standing in a room with her on the night she finally gives her answer to the man who waited 9 years for her, and what she wrote down afterwards, alone, when it was done, is one of the saddest and most clear-eyed things any woman has ever written about her own heart. Before we go back to the beginning, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will not step outside her story again until the very end. If these long evenings are the kind of company you would like to keep more often, you are always welcome to follow along, so that whenever you want a life to disappear into for a few hours, there is one here waiting for you. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the weather is doing on the other side of your window, and what time it has reached where you are, whether it is late evening, or the small hours, or that odd quiet stretch just before a winter dawn. Leave a word below if you feel like it, and I will look through them, because there is a real companionableness in knowing that all over the world, in all those different places, a great many of us are lying in the dark tonight, going into the same story together. That is all. From here on, her world is the only one there is. Picture this: a villa on a hillside above Florence in the spring of 1820, its shutters open on a warm evening, the cypresses standing up black against a sky going green and gold over the valley of the Arno. The house is called the Villa Columbia, and it is rented for the young English couple staying in it or travellers on an extended and very leisurely honeymoon tour of the continent that has already lasted 2 years and produced one daughter, and is now, in the second week of May, about to produce another. Below the terrace the city lies in its bowl of hills with the dome of the cathedral rising out of it, and the river going through it the colour of milky tea, and the bells of a dozen churches are ringing across the evening air, and the swallows are turning and turning over the rooftops in the last of the light. It is one of the loveliest places on earth to be born, and on the 12th of May a second daughter arrives there to William and Florence Nightingale, and they do what they did with the first one. They call her after the place. The elder girl who arrived the year before in Naples was given the old Greek word for that city and called Parthenope. This one takes the city outside the window. Florence. It is worth stopping on that for a moment, because it tells you something about the world she has come into. These are people so rich and so unhurried that they can spend 3 years wandering Italy while their children are born in rented villas. Her father, William Edward Nightingale, is a young man of 26 who has recently come into a great deal of money and an entirely new surname along with it. He began life as William Shaw, the son of a Sheffield banker, and at 21 he inherited the Derbyshire estates of his mother's uncle, a man named Peter Nightingale, on the condition that he take the dead man's name and arms. So he did, and became a Nightingale, and with the name came land and lead mines and an income that meant he would never in his life need to work at anything. Her mother, Fanny, is older than her husband by 5 years, handsome and sociable and ambitious in the particular way that women of that period were permitted to be ambitious, which is to say ambitious through other people, through a husband's standing, through a house, through the marriages her daughters would one day make. Fanny's own father was William Smith, a member of Parliament who spent decades of his life fighting for the abolition of slavery. So there is reforming blood on that side, and a family habit of caring what happened to strangers. The Nightingales are Unitarians, which in that England meant a certain seriousness, a certain plainness of mind, a habit of thinking for oneself about God rather than accepting what was handed down. And into that comes this second daughter, in a rented villa above Florence, with the bells going and the swallows turning outside the window. Nobody in that house has the faintest idea what has arrived. She will outlive nearly all of them. She will become, before she is 40, one of the most famous women in the world, and she will spend the second half of her long life hiding from that fame in a series of upstairs rooms. But tonight she is simply a new baby in a warm room in Italy, being given a pretty name after a pretty city, and her mother is lying back on the pillows in the lamplight thinking of the future of England, of the houses they will fill, and the seasons the girls will have, and the good marriages they will make in the fullness of time. Every single one of those plans is going to come apart in this child's hands. But that is 30 years off yet, and the evening is warm, and the bells are ringing over Florence, and we have a long way to go. The family came home to England the following year, and the first thing to understand about the childhood we are stepping into is that it was not spent in one place but in two, and the two were quite different in their nature, and she loved one of them far more than the other. Come north with me first, up into Derbyshire, to the house that was hers by feeling. It is called Lea Hurst, and her father built it, quite literally, to his own design, on the family land above the little village of Lea in the valley of the Derwent. It stands high up on the side of the hill with the ground falling away below it, and it is not enormous as such houses go, a gabled stone house of perhaps 15 bedrooms with a long terrace running along its front. But the view from that terrace is the thing you remember. The land drops from the garden wall into a wooded valley, and the river runs along the bottom of it out of sight among the trees, and the hills rise again beyond it, and past them more hills, fold upon fold of them, going grey and blue, and then very pale as they go back toward the north. This is the summer house. The family came up here every year for the warm months, and for the girls it meant a particular kind of freedom that Embley never gave them. The gardens are terraced down the hillside, with grass walks and old stone walls warm under your hand in the afternoon, and roses, and a great many flowering shrubs, and beyond the garden wall the moorland begins almost at once. High open rough country, where the wind never quite stops and the curlews call over the heather in the spring. Florence walked out on that moor at every hour of her girlhood. She rode her pony along the drystone walls and up onto the tops. She went down into the village, which was and is a scatter of grey cottages along a steep lane, and this is where the other thing begins. The thing nobody in the family thought anything of at the time. She went into the cottages. She sat with the old people. She carried down soup and jelly from the kitchen when somebody was ill, which was the ordinary duty of a young lady of the manor, and was expected of her, and she did it. And unlike almost every other young lady of the manor in England, she did not find it a chore, and she did not do it quickly and come home. She stayed. She asked what was wrong with them. She remembered from one week to the next which child had the fever, and whether the poultice had helped, and how the old man's chest was. She was a strange, grave, watchful, extremely clever little girl, and while her sister was drawing the flowers on the terrace, she was down in the village learning, without anybody teaching her, that suffering was interesting, that it had causes, and that something could sometimes be done about it. The second house was Embley, and Embley was where the family really lived, and Embley is where the trouble was. Come south with me now, right down into Hampshire, to a large plain square Georgian house near Romsey. standing warm and sheltered among enormous grounds a few miles from the New Forest. Her father bought it when Florence was 6 because Lea Hurst, however beloved, would not do as a permanent seat. It was too small, too far north, too far from London, and much too far from Fanny's ambitions. Embley was the answer. The house was big and the gardens were exceptionally fine, and the shooting was good and the county families were within reach, and both of Fanny's married sisters lived near enough for constant coming and going. It was, in short, a house arranged for society, and it was very soon filled with it. And this was the world Fanny Nightingale wanted for her girls, and to be fair to her, it was the world every sensible mother of that class wanted, because there was nothing else on offer. Consider what a rich man's daughter was actually for in 1835 in Hampshire. She was for this. She was to be beautiful and accomplished and charming, to sing a little and draw a little and speak French, to be taken to London for the season, to be admired and courted and asked for, and then to marry as high as she possibly could and spend the rest of her life running a house, rather like her mother's, and raising children who would do the same. That was the entire ladder, top to bottom. There was no other rung anywhere, and Fanny was accomplished at all of it. She entertained beautifully. She knew everyone worth knowing. She had 2 clever, pretty daughters and a large house and a fine table, and she meant to place them both handsomely. The elder daughter suited the plan. Parthenope, called Partha, was sociable and warm and gifted in exactly the ways her mother approved of, drew nicely, wrote nicely, loved company, loved the house, loved the visiting and the gossip and the arrangement of flowers, and the long, comfortable business of a country house full of guests. She belonged to that life. She was happy in it. And it is important, before we go any further, not to make her a villain in her sister's story, because she is going to behave badly later on, and she is going to suffer horribly. And the root of all of it is quite simple and quite sad. She adored her sister. She could not understand her, and she could not bear to be left behind by her. The younger daughter did not suit the plan at all. She was polite, she was dutiful, she did what was asked of her, and from somewhere very early on, she was somewhere else entirely. Guests noticed she watched them. She was thought a little cold, a little too quiet, difficult to draw out. And in the schoolroom at Embley something was happening that would have alarmed her mother very much had she understood what it meant. Before we leave the schoolroom years, come with me down the hill from Lea Hurst into the village, because there is something happening there that nobody in the family thought worth recording, and that turns out to be the seed of everything. The lane goes down steeply between Driston walls, and the cottages of Lea and Holloway are set along it and above it in a scatter, grey gritstone under grey slate, small windows, low doors, a bit of garden behind each with cabbages and a pig perhaps, and a line of washing. The people in them work in the lead mines or in the mills down in the valley bottom where the river turns the wheels and the mills take children, and the hours are long and the cottages are damp, and in winter the whole valley fills with a raw, wet cold that gets into chests and stays there. This is the world at the bottom of the garden of the beautiful house on the hill, and the two are joined by that lane, and Florence Nightingale walked it constantly from the time she was a girl. She carried down the things a young lady carried: broth from the great kitchen, jelly arrowroot, a shawl, a bottle of wine for someone very low. This was expected. Every well-brought-up daughter of every landed family in England did some version of it, and most of them did it as an errand, standing in the doorway for 5 minutes with a basket and coming away with a comfortable feeling. What was unusual about this girl was that she went in and stayed, and asked questions, and came back. She sat down by the beds. She got the names of the children and which of them had the cough that would not clear. She noticed that the same complaints came back to the same houses, and that the houses they came back to were the ones with the worst damp and the worst water and the most bodies sleeping in one room. Nobody told her that. There was no theory available to her, and she was a child. She simply observed it, over years, in the way that a certain kind of mind cannot help observing. And she found in those cottages something she had nowhere else in her life. She was useful, and she was easy. The awkward, watchful girl who could not be drawn out at her mother's dinner parties was in a sick room entirely herself. She was calm with the frightened. She was not repelled by the body and its failures, which is rarer than you would think and cannot be taught. She had good hands. And those cottagers, who were not obliged to like her, did like her and talked to her and told her things. Her family thought it charming. A young lady visiting the poor was a credit to a household, and Fanny approved of charity in its place, which was after breakfast and before luncheon, and not at any cost to one's own comfort. Nobody grasped that the child was serving an apprenticeship. By the time she was in her middle teens, she had spent more hours at the bedsides of sick people than most doctors of the period had spent by the same age, and she had learned, without a single lesson, the thing that the whole of her later work rests upon, that illness is not a mystery visited on people at random, but has causes, and that the causes are usually to be found in the room. There was a moment in her girlhood that the family did tell and retell, and it is worth having, because it is the one story about her childhood that everybody knew. A shepherd on the estate had a dog, a collie called Cap, which had been hurt, and the boys had thrown stones at it, and the shepherd believed its leg was broken and meant to have it put down, because a shepherd cannot keep a dog that cannot work. Florence, out riding with the old clergyman, went to the cottage and found the dog lying by the fire, and she and the vicar looked at the leg and decided it was badly bruised rather than broken, and she stayed and made hot compresses out of cloths wrung in boiling water, and laid them on it hour after hour, and came back the next day and did it again, and the dog got up and walked. It was a small thing, but the family kept the story and told it about her long afterwards, and there is something in it that is precisely her. The refusal of the verdict, the practical hands, the compress applied again and again until the thing was mended. Her father was educating her, not in the way girls of her rank were educated, which meant a governess and a smattering of drawing and Italian songs and enough French to be charming with, but properly, seriously, in the way a clever man of that period would have educated a son he had hopes of. William Nightingale had been to Cambridge, and had the leisure of a man who never needed to earn anything, and he taught his two daughters himself, in the library at Embley, at a long table, hour after hour, morning after morning, for years. He gave them Latin and Greek, he gave them French and German and Italian, he put them through history and philosophy and grammar and composition, and set them essays and argued the essays with them afterwards as he would have argued with a colleague. And Florence, who was the younger, turned out to have a mind of a kind that comes along very rarely, and it went through everything he could give it like water through sand. She was particularly extraordinary at mathematics, which was the one thing her mother genuinely objected to, because there was no earthly use for it in a drawing room, and it was not what young ladies did. Florence begged for a proper tutor in it, and there was a family battle about it, and eventually she got her way in a limited fashion, and she took to it with a hunger that never left her for the rest of her life. Hold on to that, because it matters enormously later on. The most famous nurse in history was first and before anything else a mathematician. What she would eventually do to the sanitary condition of the British Army she did with columns of figures. But at 14 and 15, she is simply a girl at a table in a country house library on a wet Hampshire morning, working through problems for the pleasure of it, while her sister sighs and looks out of the window, and her father, who is a mild and cultivated and rather passive man, is quietly delighted with her and has no notion at all that he is arming her against the future he intends for her. Because that was the trap, and it is worth naming plainly before we go on, because the whole of the next 15 years of her life sits inside it. She was given, by a doting father, an education that fitted her for a life that did not exist. He trained her mind to a fine edge, and then handed her back into a world in which the only permitted use of that mind was to be pleasant at dinner. She could read Plato in Greek, and she was not allowed to have an occupation. She could construct a mathematical argument, and she was expected to fill her days with worsted work, letters, calls, and the arrangement of flowers. It is one of the cruelest things that period did to its cleverest women, and it did it over and over. And the wonder is not that so many of them fell into illness and depression and strange nervous collapses. The wonder is that any of them got out. And then, when she was 17 years old, something happened to her in the grounds at Embley that decided everything. We know the date, because she wrote it down and kept the record of it all her life, and returned to it again and again in her private papers. It was the 7th of February, 1837. She was in the garden. It was winter, and the great trees on the lawns were bare, and the light in Hampshire in February is a low, thin silver that lies along the grass for a few hours in the middle of the day and is gone by 4. And out there in the cold, under one of those trees, Florence Nightingale heard, or believed with her whole being that she heard, the voice of God speak to her directly and tell her that she had work to do in his service. She was quite specific about it afterwards, and quite matter of fact, in the way that people who have had that kind of experience often are. God spoke to her and called her to his service. That was all. He did not say what the service was. That was the maddening part, and she said so. She was given the summons and not the instruction, and for the next 16 years she went about in a state of increasing torment trying to work out what on earth she had been called to do. But the fact of it never once wavered in her mind, not through everything that came after, not through the years of ridicule and obstruction and illness. She had been called. She had heard it in a garden in February when she was 17, and everything that was going to happen to her, and everything she was going to put her family through, and every proposal she was going to refuse, comes directly out of a quarter of an hour among bare trees on a winter afternoon that nobody else witnessed, and that she never doubted for a moment. She told no one. Consider what she was carrying about with her that spring. A 17-year-old girl in a country house full of guests, being fitted for gowns, being taught to be charming, sitting through dinners and picnics and morning calls, and inside her, held completely secret, the conviction that she had been personally summoned by God to a work she could not yet name. She went down to breakfast. She practiced her music. She said nothing, and almost immediately the family swept her up into exactly the life she had just been called out of, because that same year the Nightingales shut up Embley for extensive alterations and took the girls abroad, and for the next 18 months Florence Nightingale did the grand tour of Europe in the most agreeable way imaginable, and by every ordinary measure she had a wonderful time. They went by carriage, a great, slow, luxurious progress through France and Italy and Switzerland, and they stayed for months at a stretch in the cities they liked, and they had introductions everywhere. Genoa and Florence and Rome and Naples, the family went into society, and Florence, now 18 and 19, was launched into it and turned out to be extremely good at it. It surprises those who know only the later austere figure, but she was at that age charming. She was slender and graceful, with a great deal of chestnut hair and a way of fixing her attention on whoever she was speaking to that people found flattering and slightly unnerving. She danced beautifully, and she loved dancing. She went to the opera constantly and was passionate about it, and kept lists of every performance she attended. She learned to talk to statesmen and exiles and revolutionaries, of whom there were a great many about in Italy at that moment, and she found politics fascinating. She was, in short, a hit, and her mother watched her being a hit, and was thoroughly pleased, and thought the strange bookish phase was behind them. But she was keeping a private diary through all of it, and the diary tells another story entirely. In the diary she is counting. She is measuring the hours she spends dressing and being agreeable and going out, and she is asking herself what any of it is for, and reproaching herself savagely for enjoying it, because enjoying it felt to her like a betrayal of whatever it was she had been called to do. She warned herself against what she called dreaming, by which she meant the vivid daydreaming she had done since childhood, and which she considered a vice and fought against her whole life. And underneath the balls and the opera and the admiration there is the growing, grinding pressure of a young woman who has been told by God to be of use, and who is being carried around Europe in a very comfortable carriage, being of no use whatever to anybody. They came home in the spring of 1839, and Embley was finished and grander than ever, and Florence was presented at court and did the London season, and this is where the great slow siege of her 20s begins. Understand the shape of the years that follow, because they are the hardest to convey and the most important. Nothing happens in them. That is the point. For nearly a decade and a half after that voice in the garden, Florence Nightingale is a young lady at home, and her life is an unbroken procession of visits, dinners, house parties, London seasons, needlework, letters, and afternoons. She is extremely eligible. She has money and connections and a face people liked and a mind that dazzled anyone she troubled to use it on. She has offers, and she is, by her own account, quietly going out of her mind. Picture one of those days, because it is the truest picture of her youth there is. She rises in a large, comfortable bedroom at Embley and is dressed. She goes down to a breakfast that other people cooked and other people will clear. The morning contains letters, perhaps a walk, perhaps a call on a neighbour. There is luncheon. In the afternoon there are callers, and the callers must be talked to, and the talk is of nothing, of who is engaged, of a christening, of a new bonnet, of the weather, of a book nobody has read properly. There is dressing for dinner. There is dinner at length. There is the drawing-room afterwards, and music, and the working of a piece of embroidery in the candlelight until it is time to take a candle and go up. And the next day is the same, and the day after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. For a woman like her sister, that life was pleasant and full and entirely sufficient, and there is no shame in that. For Florence it was a slow suffocation. She set it down later, in a burst of white-hot prose that was not published in her lifetime, describing what that existence did to intelligent women, and it is the angriest and most modern thing she ever wrote. She said that women had passion and intellect and moral activity, all three, and that society gave them no place to put any of it. She described the way a woman's time is never her own, how she may never be alone for 10 minutes together without somebody wanting her, how she must always be interruptible, how she gets her reading in scraps between callers, and is never permitted a stretch of concentrated thought in her life. She set down the picture of women dreaming their lives away in drawing rooms because dreams were the only place anything ever happened to them. And she asked why, when a woman has been given the same faculties as her brothers, she is expected to spend them on the arrangement of a dinner table. It is a shocking piece of writing to come out of a Hampshire drawing room in that century, and she wrote it out of her own daily experience, and she kept it in a drawer. Come back with me to the middle of her 20s for a moment, because I have given you the battles and not the ordinary texture of those years, and the texture is what she was actually living in. A year of it went round like this. The winter and spring at Embley, in Hampshire, with the county coming and going, and shooting parties in the autumn before it, and the house full. Then London for the season, in a hired house, from about April into July. Then, when town emptied, the long journey north to Leyhurst for the summer and early autumn, and the Derbyshire air, and the village, and the moor. And laid over the whole of it, the endless visiting, weeks at a time in other people's houses, at Waverley with one aunt, at Fair Oak with another, at Embley's neighbours, at cousins' places in the north, and other people's weeks at a time in theirs. Okay? That is the thing that is hardest to convey. She was almost never alone, and almost never still, and yet she did nothing. She was in a carriage, or in somebody's spare bedroom, or at somebody's table, or walking somebody's garden, more or less permanently, from the age of 20 to the age of 33. And a young lady in that position had duties, and she did them. She kept up the family correspondence and wrote the notes of condolence and congratulation. She did her share of the flowers. She sat with her father in the evenings and read to him. She helped Parthy with her drawings and her articles. She was, by every account of the people who stayed in those houses, a delightful and thoughtful guest, and an attentive daughter, and it cost her something every day to be it. And here is the detail that says the most about that decade, and it is a very small one. She used to steal the early mornings, as I told you, up at 6 with a candle, working on her hospital reports before the household stirred. When she was staying in other people's houses, she went on doing it, in a guest bedroom in Buckinghamshire or Yorkshire, in the dark of a winter morning, with the fire not yet laid and her breath showing, wrapped in a shawl. A young woman who was supposed to be enjoying a house party sat and made abstracts of the annual reports of the Hôpital de la Charité. You can measure a person by what they do with the hours nobody is watching. She was not sneaking off to write poetry or love letters. She was doing homework for an examination that no one intended ever to set her. And there is a last thing about those years that I want to give you, because it is easy to hear this story as one of unbroken frustration, and it was not. She was funny. That comes off every page of her private writing and out of the memories of everyone who knew her well, and it is the first casualty of the saintly version of her. She was a first-class mimic. She had a satirical eye and used it on bishops and generals and her own committee. Her letters to intimates are full of jokes, some of them very dry, some of them wicked, about the people she was obliged to be polite to. She named her cats after politicians so that she could say outrageous things about a cabinet minister in her own drawing room. When a pompous man wrote asking for her views, she was capable of a reply that was courteous on the surface and left him bleeding quietly for a week. And she was loved by a lot of people, and she was capable of enormous warmth, and there is a whole seam of it in her letters to the young women who trained at her school. Encouragement, concern about their health, small presents, advice about difficult matrons, and a real and detailed interest in their lives that went on for decades. So do not carry away a picture of a grim woman. Carry away a picture of somebody formidable and impatient and extremely funny, who was given one deep grief early, which was the waste of her youth, and one heavy burden in the middle, which was the dead men of that first winter, and who worked with unbelievable persistence for 60 years, and who liked cats and gossip and the desert and a good argument, and who ended up, at 90, quiet and blind and content in a warm room with the sun coming in. There is one more room in her girlhood to look into before the long empty years begin, and it is the sick room of the family itself, because it was in her own house, among her own people, that she got the rest of her early training. In a large household of that period, there was almost always somebody ill. There were no antibiotics and no vaccines beyond the one for smallpox, and the ordinary infections of childhood carried children off regularly, and the finest houses were quite as vulnerable as the cottages to typhoid and scarlet fever and the rest, because the drains of a fine country house were frequently worse than the drains of a labourer's cottage, being more elaborate and less understood. Add to that the enormous web of relations that such a family carried, the aunts and cousins and grandmothers scattered across 3 counties, and there was always somebody, somewhere, laid up. And whenever there was, they sent for Florence. It began when she was very young, and it never stopped. Her grandmother, Shaw, old and failing, was nursed by her. Her old nurse, Mrs. Gale, was nursed by her. An aunt with a difficult confinement wanted Florence, and got her. When there was scarlet fever in a cousin's house, it was Florence who went. She was, by her early 20s, the acknowledged sick-room expert of an extended family of some size, sent for by carriage across counties whenever anything went wrong, and she went every time gladly, because it was the only work she was allowed, and it was the nearest thing to happiness she had. Consider what that came to in practice, because it is very unlike our idea of a young lady of fashion. It involved sitting up all night in a hot-shut room with somebody dying. There were the smells and the sounds of serious illness, the sponging and the turning, the changing of linen under a body that cannot move, the emptying of basins, the hours of holding a hand at 3 in the morning when the fever climbs. She was present at deaths, several of them before she was 25, and she found in all of it not distress but a settled, deep satisfaction, and understood perfectly well how strange that made her, and worried about it, and could not help it. There is a bitter joke buried in this, and she was well aware of it. Nursing was, in her mother's view, an unspeakable occupation for a gentlewoman if it was done in a hospital for strangers and paid for. Nursing was a beautiful womanly duty if it was done at home for relatives and unpaid. It was the identical work. She could sit up all night with an aunt's typhoid and be praised for it, and she could not walk into a public ward and do the same for a stranger without disgracing her family. That single inconsistency is the whole prison of her 20s in one sentence, and it drove her nearly mad, and it is the thing she would eventually smash. So when people say that Florence Nightingale had no training before she went to the East, they are wrong, and she knew they were wrong, and it was one of the things that most irritated her about the legend that grew up around her. She had no formal qualification, because none existed for a woman to take, but by the time she finally sailed for the East, she had nursed the dying in cottages and in great houses for the better part of 20 years, worked 3 months on the wards at Kaiserswerth, spent time with the Sisters of Charity in Paris, and gone through their hospitals, and most of all, she had read. This is the other secret occupation of those years, and it is the strangest and most touching of all of them. In the mornings before the household was up, she got out of bed in the winter dark and worked. That was the only time she could not be interrupted, and she took it. From about 6 until the family breakfast, she sat in her room with a candle in the cold, wrapped in a shawl, and she studied hospitals. Her father, who could refuse her a life but could not refuse her a book, got her what she asked for, and what she asked for was not poetry. It was the annual reports of hospitals. It was government blue books, the great dull official volumes of statistics and sanitary reports and commissions of inquiry. It was the reports of the hospitals of Paris and Berlin and Dublin and Edinburgh, of the lying-in institutions, of the great charitable foundations, in French and German as well as English. She read them for years, and she made abstracts of them, and she filled notebooks with tables of comparative figures, hospital by hospital, city by city. How many beds, how many admissions, how many died, of what, at what cost, in what kind of building. Picture that for a moment, because it is one of the loveliest and loneliest images in her whole life. A young woman of enormous privilege in a cold bedroom at 6 in the morning by one candle, with the great house asleep around her and the frost on the inside of the glass, making tables of the death rates of foreign hospitals, for no purpose she can name, for no institution that has asked her, with no prospect whatever of ever being permitted to use any of it. She did that in secret, for something like 10 years. And that is why when the letter came from Sidney Herbert, she could answer it within a day. When the moment finally arrived, the most underemployed woman in England was also, by an enormous margin, the best informed person in the country on the administration of hospitals, and not one soul in her mother's drawing room had the least idea. Let me put you inside one London season with her, because the season is the machine that all of this was fighting against, and it is worth seeing it working. It begins after Easter and runs until the middle of the summer, and for the several months of it the whole landed class of Britain leaves its acres and comes to town. The Nightingales took a furnished house, as everybody did, in one of the good streets, and for those months the family lived in a way that was almost the exact opposite of Lea Hurst, shut in, formal, crowded, and busy from noon until 3 in the morning. The purpose of the season, beneath the flowers and the music, was the arrangement of marriages. That is what it was for. It gathered the eligible young of an entire class into a few square miles of London for a few months every year so that they could be looked over. Everything in it served that end. There was the presentation at court, which was the formal moment a girl became a marriageable adult in the eyes of society. The enormous stiff train, the plumes in the hair, the long wait in the carriage in the queue up the Mall, the crush of the drawing room at the palace, the few seconds in front of the Queen, the deep curtsy practised for weeks, the backward walk out. Florence did it. Her mother was in her element. Then the round begins, and it is relentless. Morning calls, which are made in the afternoon, 15 minutes at a time, with cards left on a tray in the hall. Rides in the park at the fashionable hour, where everyone sees everyone. Dinners of 20. The opera, where the point of the box is as much to be visible in it as to hear what is sung. Concerts, breakfasts that happen at 4 in the afternoon, and above all the balls, which begin at 10 at night and go on until the sky is grey, at which a girl dances with a succession of young men, and her mother watches from the side of the room and adds up. And there is Florence Nightingale, in the thick of it, being admired. She was good at it. That is the thing to hold on to. She was not a plain, awkward girl standing by the wall. She was slender and graceful and quick, with a great deal of soft brown hair, and she was one of the more sought-after young women of her set. She danced well and liked dancing. She was witty in a dry way that made older men take notice, and she had that trick of concentrated attention that flatters whoever it lands on. Statesmen liked talking to her, and she had a gift, all her life, for making powerful men interested in what she thought, which is a large part of why she was eventually able to move an empire from a bed. So she was not shut out of that world. She could have had it. That is what makes the refusal so remarkable, and what her mother could never forgive. It was not that society rejected Florence. Florence rejected society with a full understanding of what she was giving up, and she gave it up when it was hers for the taking, because the diary tells you what the ballroom did not. Through all of those seasons she is keeping a private account, and in it she is counting the cost of every evening. The hours consumed, the vacancy of the talk, the sense of her mind going soft from disuse. She writes of the strain of a whole day given over to arranging herself for other people's eyes, and of coming home at 3 in the morning having said nothing she meant. She reproaches herself for enjoying the admiration. She calls the drawing-room life in one of her sharpest phrases, a death by starvation of the mind. And through those same years she is watching her contemporaries do the things she cannot bring herself to do. The girls she came out with are engaged and married and confined, and there are christenings. and then the young husbands and the establishments and the being called upon, her cousins and friends drop away one by one into it. And she goes to the weddings and holds the babies, and comes home and gets up before dawn and does her hospital reports by candlelight, and tells nobody, "Now let me bring you closer to the two women she was up against," because the great struggle of Florence Nightingale's young life was not with society in the abstract. It was with her mother and her sister, in rooms, day after day, for years, and it was carried on in the particular way that family warfare is carried on among people who love each other and cannot separate, by tears, by illness, by reproach, by scenes at breakfast, by long silences, by the endless, invisible pressure of being three women in a house with nothing to do but mind one another's business. Let me show you what a hospital actually was in the year she was born, because everything she did rests on this, and it is almost impossible to imagine now. A hospital in that England was a charity, not a service. It was founded by subscription, governed by a committee of gentlemen, and intended for the deserving poor, which meant working people who might reasonably be patched up and sent back to work. If you had money, you were never taken to one in your life. You were nursed at home in your own bed by your own women, and the doctor came to you. The hospital was for people with nowhere else, and it took the curable by preference, and it turned away the dying, the chronic, the infectious, the pregnant, and children, and anybody whose death would spoil its published figures. Inside, the wards were long rooms with the beds close together, and the windows were kept shut, because the theory of the day held that disease was carried on foul air, and yet the same theory somehow produced rooms sealed against draughts. The floors were wood and scrubbed rarely. There was no such thing as a sterile instrument, because there was no theory of infection to make anyone want one, and a surgeon operated in an old coat kept for the purpose, stiff with the work of previous years, and thought nothing of it. Surgeons were judged partly on speed, because until the middle of the century there was no anaesthetic, and the great limb operations were done on a conscious person held down by strong men in a matter of a minute or two. The mortality after surgery was frightful, and nobody could say why, and men died of what they called hospital gangrene, which killed most reliably in the biggest and busiest hospitals, and the connection between that fact and the state of the wards was not drawn. And the nursing, which is the part that concerns us, was done by women hired off the street. There was no training, no examination, no uniform, no career, and no respectability. A nurse might be a widow with nothing, or a woman who had failed at other work. She was paid badly, fed on the ward, and very often slept in a cupboard or a corner of it. Drink was the great problem, and it was a problem because of the nature of the work rather than the nature of the women. They were unsupported, unrelieved, and in constant contact with things nobody had prepared them for. And they were, in the public mind, a joke, the sort of coarse gin-fond figure that novelists put in for comedy. That is the picture Fanny Nightingale had in her head when her daughter said she wanted to work in a hospital, and, given that picture, her horror was not unreasonable. There was one exception in Europe, and Florence found it, which is why the Rhine mattered so much. The Catholic nursing orders had, for centuries, put educated women of good family into the wards under discipline and rule, and everybody who compared French and English military hospitals could see the difference the sisters made. It was that comparison, published in the Times in the autumn of 1854, that shamed England into sending her out, and it is one of the neater ironies of the whole affair that the model for the great Protestant nursing reform of the 19th century was at bottom the convent. She understood exactly what she was doing when she borrowed the shape of it. Her nurses lived together in a home attached to the hospital. There was a matron with real authority over them. There were rules of conduct, a set training, a record kept of every probationer's progress and character, and a certificate at the end. She took the discipline and the collective life of a religious order and stripped out the religion, and what she produced was a secular profession for women, the first of any consequence in Britain, and every profession women have entered since has stood on the ground that one cleared. Fanny first. It is easy to make her a monster, and she was not one. She was a woman of her time doing what she believed to be her whole duty, which was to see her daughters well settled, and she had been given a daughter who wanted something that Fanny could not even picture, let alone approve. When Florence, at 24, finally admitted what had been forming in her mind for years, that she wanted to work in a hospital, her mother's horror was not snobbery alone. Consider what a hospital was in 1844. It was where the poor went to die. Respectable people were nursed at home, and the women who worked on the wards were, with a few religious exceptions, drawn from the roughest class, badly paid, entirely untrained, and possessed of a reputation for drunkenness, and worse, that was not always undeserved. The wards were filthy. The nurses often slept in them. For the daughter of a gentleman to propose to go and live and work in such a place was, to Fanny, very nearly the same as proposing to walk the streets. It was the ruin of her, the ruin of her sister's chances, the ruin of the family's name. Fanny said so at length and wept, and the scenes went on for years and years. And Parthy was worse, because Parthy was more complicated. She was not merely a conventional woman defending a conventional plan. She had the most intense attachment to her younger sister, an attachment that had something almost devouring in it, and she experienced Florence's desire to leave as a personal abandonment and reacted to it exactly as an abandoned lover would. She raged. She wept. She fell ill and could not be left. She told Florence that her leaving would kill her, and there were periods when the doctors half agreed. She became, over the years of that struggle, genuinely unwell, in a way the period called nerves, and had no better word for, and Florence, who was the sister with the healing hands, was expected to stay at home and nurse her, and the terrible circularity of that is not lost on anybody looking at it now. The one useful occupation her family would permit her was the care of the sister whose collapse was the chief obstacle to her ever getting away. So there she is, in her middle and late 20s, in one or other of two beautiful houses, with a mother who cried, a sister who was ill at strategic moments, and a father who agreed with her privately, sympathized and did nothing, because he could not face his wife. And in the middle of it, the man, now to the 2 years that were the very bottom of all this. Something happened when she was around 25 that she never forgot, and that decided her. She had, at last, worked out what she was after. It had come to her clearly. She meant to go and train in a hospital, and she had fixed on one, which was Salisbury Infirmary, 3 miles or so from Embley, where the head physician was a friend of the family. It was the mildest, most respectable, most local proposal imaginable. She would be near home. She would be under a man her father knew. She was 24 years old. She put it to her family in the winter, and the effect was as if she had proposed to run away with a groom. Her mother was, quite literally, hysterical about it. Nurses in a county infirmary in 1845 were drawn from the servant class and had a public reputation, deserved or not, for drink and worse. To Fanny it was not a career, it was a fall. She raged and wept and appealed to everyone she could think of. And Parthenope, whose reaction was more terrible because it was made of love, had something like a breakdown over it, and screamed at her sister, and accused her of wanting to destroy the family, and said she had a mania. Her father, who might have settled it, retreated behind his newspaper and left the house to escape the noise. The whole thing was refused absolutely, and the subject was closed, and Florence was expected to go on as before. She was 24, and she had asked for the single thing she cared about, in the mildest possible form, and been told no by every person she loved. That is when the illness of the mind began in earnest, and I want to say something about it because it is the least understood part of her and the most human. For the next several years, Florence Nightingale suffered what we would now recognise instantly as a long depressive collapse, with periods of something close to breakdown. She could not concentrate. She fell into her old vice of dreaming, hours at a time, sitting apparently in company and entirely absent, living out an imagined existence in which she was somebody who worked, and afterwards she came to herself with a kind of horror and self-disgust, and recorded it as a fall. She lost her appetite for everything. She was often physically unwell, and the physical and the mental fed one another, as they do. She wrote that she was starving. She set down that she saw no future ahead of her, and that she had thought of dying as a rest. And all of this went on inside a beautiful house, in the middle of a loving and anxious family, at dinners and picnics and Christmas parties, and to the visitors she was a rather quiet, elegant young woman in good silk, with not a thing the matter with her. It is worth remembering that when you look at the smooth surfaces of other people's lives, and it is worth remembering when you look at the Victorians in particular, in their heavy frames, with their calm painted faces. There is a document from the middle of her wilderness years that I have mentioned twice and not shown you properly, and it deserves its own moment, because it is the single most startling thing she ever wrote, and almost nobody has heard of it. She set it down at about 32, in the worst of her confinement at home. It is a short piece of prose, half essay and half fiction, and she called it Cassandra, after the princess of Troy who was given true prophecy and cursed, so that nobody would ever believe a word she said. That is what she felt like, and the title is The Whole Argument. What she set down in it is an anatomy of the lives of women of her own class, and it is written in a heat that is startling to meet, because she never allowed herself that tone anywhere in public. She says that women are given passion, intellect and moral activity, and that in the state of society then existing there was not one of the three they were permitted to use. She describes the day of such a woman as a thing chopped into fragments, never a portion of the day that is hers, never a stretch of thought uninterrupted, always liable to be called for, her books read in snatches, and her mind never permitted to take hold of anything and go with it. She says that women are trained to think that any occupation of their own is a selfishness. She writes with real fury about the drawing room in the evening, the family circle, all of them sitting there together, doing nothing that requires the smallest part of their capacity, the women with their work in their hands to make idleness look industrious. And she says that people call this the highest happiness of life, and that it is killing them. And then she says the thing that people still quote, that women dream of a life of the mind and of useful work, and that the dreaming is the disease, because dreams are what you are given instead of a life. She meant to publish it. Friends advised against, and she put it away, and it sat unread among her papers, and it was not printed in full until long after her death, and when it came out in the middle of the last century, it startled everybody, because it reads like something written a century later. It is one of the sharpest pieces of writing about the condition of women that century produced, and it was written in a country house in Hampshire by a woman who was, that same afternoon, going to have to go down and be pleasant to callers. Hold that in your mind alongside the lamp. The nurse of the popular imagination, the gentle figure at the bedside, was also this, a very angry, very clever woman who understood exactly what had been done to her and to every woman she knew, and who wrote it down and locked it in a drawer, and then went and changed the world instead of arguing about it. Then the years went by, and none of it shifted, and she came into her 30s, and it began to look as though it never would. His name was Richard Monckton Milnes, and he is one of the saddest figures in the story, and I want you to know him a little before we come to the night that ended it. He was a poet and a politician, a decade or so older than Florence, a man of very great charm and enormous social gifts, the sort of man who knew everyone and made rooms happier by coming into them. He was clever without being cold. He collected books and befriended writers and championed unfashionable causes, and he did practical good in the world. He was one of the people behind the reformatory schools for young offenders, which was not a fashionable cause and did not benefit him at all. He was, in short, a genuinely good and interesting man, and he was not remotely stupid, and this is important. Of all the people around Florence Nightingale then, he came the closest to understanding what she was. He fell in love with her when she was in her early 20s, and he asked her to marry him, and she did not say no, and she did not say yes. And that state of affairs went on for 9 years, 9 of them. Turn that over for a moment as you lie there. He waited for her from her early 20s into her 30th year, through seasons and house parties and journeys abroad, seeing her, writing to her, hoping, and being told nothing conclusive. Her family desperately wanted the match. It was a brilliant one by every measure they understood. Her mother would have given her right arm for it. Her father liked him, and Florence herself, and she was completely honest about this in her private papers, loved him. That is what people forget. This was not a woman refusing a man she was indifferent to in order to keep her freedom. She was in love with him. She wrote that he was the man she could have been happy with, that his mind suited hers, that his company was the greatest pleasure she had. And she could not do it, and she knew she could not do it, and it took her 9 years to be able to say so. In the summer of 1849, when she was 29, Milnes finally asked her to decide. He had waited long enough, and any man would have. And she gave him her answer, and the answer was no. Now let me tell you what she wrote afterwards, alone, because it is one of the most extraordinary passages I know of, and it is the reason this evening began where it did. She sat down in private and set out, for nobody's eyes but her own, exactly why she had refused the man she loved. She set out that she required satisfaction in 3 separate ways. There was her intellect, and that she granted he fed entirely, more than any other person she had met. There was her passionate side, and she was frank about this, allowing that he answered that too. And then there was a third part of her, moral and active, which needed a great work to spend itself on, and this one would find nothing to feed on in the life she would live as his wife. She would be, as she put it, spending her days arranging society and domestic matters. And she went on to say the thing that gives the whole passage its terrible clarity, that she could have been satisfied to spend a life with him if the two of them had been combining their different powers on some great object together. It was not him. It was what marriage to him would make her. She was 30. She had a mind trained like a scholar's and a calling she could not name, and no work of any kind. And she had just, deliberately, with her eyes open, given up the one thing that might have made an ordinary happiness possible for her. He married someone else soon afterwards, and he stayed her friend for the rest of his life, and 3 decades on he was still sitting on the council of her nursing school, still helping her, still there. Somewhere in his poetry there is a poem about 2 people who meet in company and are perfectly composed with one another, and whose letters are covered in the marks of weeping, and it had gone on a very long time. Make of that what you will. And the period immediately after the refusal was the worst of her life. This is the pit of it, and if you are drifting off already, then let this part pass over you gently, because it is dark and it does not last. She was 30. She had refused the escape route that marriage offered. She was still living at home. Her mother and sister redoubled their efforts. She was not permitted to train, not permitted to work, not permitted to be alone. expected to be pleasant at dinner, and she went down into what we would now recognize without hesitation as a severe depression. She could not eat properly. She could not sleep. She felt herself becoming stupid. She wrote in her private papers that she was going mad and that she longed for death as a sick man longs for morning. She spent her days in a kind of dreaming trance she despised herself for. She thought seriously about how easy it would be to die, and she was, in every visible respect, an enviable young woman in a beautiful house with an income and no troubles at all, which is a thing worth remembering the next time you look at somebody's life from the outside. What saved her, and it is the loveliest turn in all of it, was travel and an owl. In the autumn of 1849, immediately after the refusal, family friends called the Bracebridges swept her off to Egypt. They were kind, sensible, cultivated people who could see perfectly well what was happening to her at home, and they simply took her away from it. And for the whole winter, Florence Nightingale went up the Nile in a boat. Let this be a place to rest for a while, because it is the most beautiful stretch of her whole young life. Picture the river in December, the dahabeah, with its great triangular sail, moving slowly south against the current, the water very wide and very still in the mornings, the banks a narrow ribbon of green, and then, immediately beyond, the desert. She woke every day to that light, which is like no other light in the world, and to the smell of the river and the sound of the ropes. They went ashore among temples that had been half swallowed by sand. She sat in the vast ruined halls at Karnak. She got up before dawn to see the light come onto the colossal seated figures at Abu Simbel, and she wrote about it afterwards with a kind of awe that has nothing of the tourist in it. She felt the effect of the place expressed a spiritual grandeur beyond anything she could have imagined, that it was like thousands of voices all lifting in one feeling at once. And in those temples, in that immense quiet, the voice that had been silent for years spoke to her again. At Thebes, she recorded in her diary that God had called her once more. Near Cairo, some days later, she wrote down what she understood the call to be, that God had asked her whether she would do good for him alone, without reputation. She was 30 years old, alone in her cabin on a river in Egypt, writing that down, and on the way home in Athens she found the owl. It was a fledgling little owl, fallen or taken from a nest in the ruins on the Acropolis and being tormented by some children, and Florence bought it from them and put it in her pocket, and it stayed with her for the next 5 years. She called it Athena. It lived in her pocket, and about her person. It travelled with her. It perched on her finger. It was fed by hand and grew tame and cross and possessive, and would fluff itself up and hiss at anyone who came near her. There is a drawing of her by her sister, with the owl sitting on her hand. Parthenope, who could not follow her sister into the work, could at least love the owl, and later wrote a small illustrated book about its life. For 5 years that bird went everywhere with Florence Nightingale, into drawing rooms and railway carriages and hospitals, a small, fierce, feathered creature in the pocket of the most formidable woman in England. Stay with that winter a little longer, because I have given you the beauty of it, and not the cost, and the cost is where the whole shape of her becomes visible. The boat itself was home for months. A long, low wooden hull with a cabin aft divided into small rooms, and a crew of 12 Egyptian sailors who slept on deck and sang, as they worked and hauled the vessel by rope from the bank whenever the wind failed. They tied up at night under the palms and the stars, and went ashore in the mornings on donkeys, and drifted south into the enormous quiet of Upper Egypt, with nothing arranged, no callers, no mother in the next room, and nobody at all to be pleasant to. But it is what she wrote in the cabin at night that matters, because she was in agony half of that time. The diary of that winter is the private record of a woman in a spiritual crisis, and it is not tranquil at all. She reproaches herself constantly. She records her dreaming and calls it her disease. She writes that she cannot be worthy, that she has wasted her life, that she is 30. And into that, again out of nowhere, the thing came back that had first come to her in a Hampshire garden at 17. The sense of being called, and specifically now, the demand that she should be prepared to do good without any credit for it, in obscurity, unthanked, for God alone. She said yes to that on the river, and though she did not know it, and would spend another 4 years fighting her family before anything came of it, that yes is the exact point at which the rest of her life turns. It is worth noticing, too, that the two great sanities of her later existence were both formed in that same 12-month stretch, the desert, and then Kaiserswerth. First, the enormous silence in which she settled what she was for, and then, 6 months later, a plain German institution that showed her the concrete form the answer could take. She came home from that year with her direction fixed forever, and had to walk straight back into the drawing room at Embley, and be told that a cousin was engaged. On the way home from Egypt, in the summer of 1850, she made a detour that changed her life, and it was to a place that would sound to you and me like nothing much at all. A small institution in a village on the Rhine, near Dusseldorf, called Kaiserswerth. It had been founded by a Lutheran pastor named Theodor Fliedner and his wife, and what they had done there was quietly revolutionary. They had taken respectable young women, mostly the daughters of farmers and tradesmen, and trained them and organised them and set them to work as deaconesses, caring for the sick and the destitute and the orphaned under discipline, with a proper structure and a proper moral standing. That was the whole of it. It was not grand. The buildings were plain, the food was plain, the beds were hard, the days began before dawn and were long and hard and rigidly ordered. And to Florence Nightingale, arriving there at 30, was the answer to 16 years of unanswered prayer, because here at last, in the actual visible world, was the thing she had been told did not exist. Women of good character, trained, respected, doing the work of caring for the sick as a vocation rather than as a last resort. She stayed a fortnight that first time. She went back the following summer, in 1851, and stayed 3 months, and she had to fight her family to be allowed even that, and the fight was appalling. Her mother and sister behaved as though she were proposing to disgrace them forever. There were scenes Parthe had a species of collapse. In the end, her father took his wife and elder daughter off to a spa to be treated for their nerves, and in the confusion Florence slipped away to Germany and got her 3 months. And they were, she said, the happiest of her life to that point. Consider what they consisted of. She rose at 5. She ate bread and gruel and vegetable soup, standing up, in 10 minutes. She worked on the wards all day. She learned to dress wounds and to lift and turn patients, and to keep a ward clean, and how to sit with the dying. She attended operations. She was up at night with children. She had almost no privacy, no comfort, no society, none of the deference she had been surrounded by since birth, and she was so happy that she wrote home in a kind of rapture and said she had never been so contented in her life. That is what 30 years of a beautiful, useless existence does to a woman with a mind. Give her hard work with a purpose in it, and gruel eaten standing up, and she will tell you she has come home. Let me take you through one whole day at Kaiserswerth, because I have told you she was happy there, and I have not shown you what the happiness consisted of, and it is worth seeing, since it is the only period of her young life in which she got exactly what she asked for. The place is a small town on the Rhine below Dusseldorf, flat country, the great river going by wide and grey and busy with barges. The institution is a scatter of plain buildings. a hospital of about 100 beds, an orphanage, an infant school, a house for the training of the deaconesses, and a penitentiary for discharged women prisoners, which was Pastor Fliedner's first work and the root of everything else. Nothing about it is beautiful. The rooms are whitewashed and bare, the furniture is what is needed and no more, and there is a smell of scrubbed board and carbolic and coffee. She rose at 5 in the dark for much of the year. There was a short prayer, and then bread and gruel taken standing up, in about 10 minutes, because sitting down to breakfast was not part of the day. Then the wards until noon. She was put to work like any other probationer, without regard for who she was, and the work was the plain physical work of nursing, washing patients, changing linen under them, making beds with a body still in them, dressing wounds, applying poultices and leeches, giving out medicines, lifting, turning, carrying. She was 30 years old and had never in her life carried anything heavier than a basket, and she came home with the hands of a working woman and was quietly proud of it. At noon, a dinner of about 10 minutes, usually broth and vegetables, occasionally meat, then more wards, and the teaching the deaconesses were instructed as well as worked, in the elements of anatomy, and the treatment of the sick, and the keeping of records, and there were classes, and there were examinations. At about 7 there was tea, standing again. In the evening there was a lecture or a Bible reading, and prayers, and by 10 o'clock the whole institution was dark and everybody was asleep, and at 5 the next morning it began again. That was it. That was the entirety of the paradise she had been begging her family for. No comfort, no privacy, no conversation of the kind she was used to, no music, no wit, no society, no deference. She shared a room, she ate standing, she was ordered about by women whose fathers were farmers, and she wrote home from it in a state of open joy and said she had never been so well or so happy in her life, and afterwards, for years, she counted that summer as the best time she had ever had. There is a great deal in that if you turn it over. She was not, in the end, a woman who wanted to be gentle at bedsides. She was a woman who wanted a system, a rota, a discipline, a body of trained people with a common purpose, and a job of work to do inside it that had a beginning and an end and could be done well or badly. She had been suffocating for 13 years in a life of unlimited leisure. What saved her was a hard bed, a bell at 5, and somebody else's timetable. She was honest about the shortcomings too, which is very like her. She thought the actual nursing at Kaiserswerth was not particularly skilled. She said the hygiene was poor, and the training was thinner than it should have been, and the surgical practice was behind England. What she took from it was not technique. It was proof that respectable women could be organised into a disciplined body and do this work with honour, that it could be a vocation and a structure rather than a last resort, and that the thing she had been dreaming about in a Hampshire bedroom actually existed somewhere in the world, in brick, with a bell and a timetable. And when she came away at the end of that summer, she came away with the design in her head that she would eventually build at St. Thomas's a home for the nurses, a matron with authority, an ordered day, a course of instruction, a record of every woman's progress and character. Everything except the Lutheran theology and the gruel. She came back to England from that, and had to go straight back into the drawing room, and for another 2 years the siege continued. But something had changed in her, and everyone around her felt it. She had seen the thing existing. It was no longer a wild imagining of hers. It was a plain institution on the Rhine with a roof and a rota, and it worked, and she had done the work herself and been good at it. The thing finally broke open in 1853, and it broke open partly because of a doctor's advice and partly because of money. The family physician, Sir James Clark, who had watched Florence sink into illness and misery for years and had a good deal more sense than the rest of them, said plainly what nobody in the family would say, that this young woman needed to leave home. And her father, at last, in the only decisive act of his life in this whole affair, gave her an allowance of £500 a year. It was a great deal of money then, enough for a single woman to live on independently and comfortably for the rest of her days. And with it he gave her, in effect, her freedom, quietly, without ever quite confronting his wife about it. And in August of 1853, at 33 years of age, Florence Nightingale left home and took her first post, and I want you to see the place she went to, because it is not the Crimea, and nobody remembers it, and it is where she actually became what she became. It was a small charitable hospital in Upper Harley Street, in London, for gentlewomen who had fallen ill and had no money, governesses mostly, the great pitiable class of educated women without families or fortunes, who had spent their lives in other people's houses teaching other people's children, and had nowhere at all to go when their health failed. Florence Nightingale went there as superintendent unpaid, and ran it for a little over a year, and what she did in that year is the first proper glimpse of the woman she truly was, because she turned out, to everyone's astonishment, including possibly her own, to be an administrator of genius. She did not merely nurse. She looked at that little institution with the eye of a mathematician and an engineer, and rebuilt it from the inside out. She had piped hot water put in on every floor, because she had watched maids exhausting themselves carrying cans upstairs, and calculated what it cost in labour. She had a windlass installed to bring the meals up so that food arrived hot and nobody had to carry trays up 3 flights. She had bells put in so that a patient could ring from her bed, and a valve would drop where the nurse could see it, and she noticed and objected that the bells rang in the passage where nobody could tell which room had called. She fought the committee over the linen and the drugs, and the accounts and the appointment of a proper medical officer, and on the question of which women might be admitted, she went to war with her own governing board, who wished to keep the institution for Anglicans, and told them flatly that she would resign unless Catholic and Jewish gentlewomen could be taken in. She won that. She was, in other words, doing at 33 exactly what she would do to the entire British Army 10 years later, measuring, counting, redesigning, refusing to be soothed, and quietly terrifying committees of men. And then, in August of 1854, cholera came to Soho. It was one of the most concentrated and lethal outbreaks in London's history. A few streets around Broad Street where hundreds of people died within days, and it happened a short walk from Harley Street. Florence Nightingale went down into it. She left her comfortable superintendency and went to work at the Middlesex Hospital as the cases came in, and she was there through the worst of it, receiving women brought in from the courts and alleys of that neighbourhood, many of them prostitutes, most of them beyond saving by anything medicine then had. She worked through nights on end. She undressed them and washed them herself. People who saw her there never forgot it. So when the letters started arriving from the East, the woman they were addressed to was not a well-meaning amateur with a lamp. She was 34 years old, trained in Germany, seasoned by a cholera epidemic, and already the most capable hospital administrator in England, and almost nobody knew it. The war had begun in the spring of that year. Britain and France had gone into the Crimea alongside the Turks against Russia, and by the autumn something happened that had never happened in any previous war in history. The British public found out what was going on. There were newspaper correspondents at the front, and there was a telegraph, and William Howard Russell of the Times sent home dispatches from the Crimea that were printed in London within days. And what he described caused a national convulsion. He described the wounded of the battles being shipped across the Black Sea to the great barracks at Scutari on the far shore from Constantinople, and what awaited them there. There were no bandages. There were no basins, no towels, no soap, no trays, no plates, no operating tables in the wards. Women lay on the floor in the clothes they had been carried in, still stiff with mud and blood for want of anything to change them into. The surgeons were overwhelmed, and Russell wrote, and this was the sentence that lit the fire, that the French had sisters of charity nursing their sick, and asked bluntly why England had no such women to send. That question was read aloud in 10,000 breakfast rooms, and the country boiled over. And in London, the man responsible for the army's medical arrangements, Sidney Herbert, the Secretary at War, sat down to write to the one person in England he believed could do anything about it. He and his wife knew Florence Nightingale well. They had been friends for years, and he had watched her work in Harley Street, and he knew precisely what she was. And here is one of the small, perfect coincidences of history. On the very same day that Sidney Herbert sat down to write and ask Florence Nightingale to take a party of nurses to the East, Florence Nightingale sat down and wrote to Sidney Herbert to offer to go. The two letters crossed in the post. She was given an official appointment, which was itself unprecedented, superintendent of the female nursing establishment in the English General Military Hospitals in Turkey. She had 8 days. 8 days. The speed of what followed tells you more about her than anything in the legend does, and nobody ever puts it in the story. The offer came from Sidney Herbert on a Saturday. By the following Saturday she was on her way out of England with a party of 38 women, assembled, interviewed, clothed, equipped and shipped, and if you have ever tried to organise even a small group of people to go anywhere at all, you will know what that means. There was no body of trained nurses to draw upon, because there was no training, so she had to recruit from 3 quite separate worlds and hold them together. There were Anglican sisters from religious institutions, women of education and strong opinions. There were Roman Catholic nuns, some from a convent in Bermondsey, some from Ireland, who came with their own superiors and their own bishops and their own rules of obedience. And there were hired nurses of the ordinary hospital sort, women who came for the wages of £1 a week and had never been out of England and had, several of them, exactly the habits their reputation suggested. She interviewed and turned away a great many. Hundreds of women applied in the end, over the following months, moved by a mixture of patriotism, piety, restlessness, and the wish to escape their own lives. And she took very few of them, and she was pitilessly practical about her reasons. She did not want enthusiasts. She wanted women who could work. She had them dressed alike, which was itself a stroke of sense, in a plain grey uniform that everybody complained about, and that made them instantly identifiable as a body under her authority, rather than a collection of individual women wandering about a military hospital. And she laid down, before they sailed, the rules that would hold that expedition together and preserve its reputation. No nurse to go into a ward alone at night. No nurse to leave the hospital except in a party and with permission. No religious argument with the patients whatsoever, and no attempt of any kind to work on a dying man's beliefs, whether Anglican or Catholic. Any woman who broke that last rule would be sent home, and she meant it, and she did it. That rule mattered more than any other, and here is why. A large part of the English public was quite prepared to believe that a party of women containing Catholic nuns sent out at government expense to nurse dying Protestant soldiers was a plot. There were letters in the newspapers about it. There were questions asked. Had one confirmed story ever emerged of a nun pressing her faith on a dying man in that hospital? The whole undertaking would have been destroyed within a month, and with it any prospect of women being allowed near a military hospital again for a generation. She understood that on the day she was appointed, and she governed accordingly, and no such story ever emerged. Then the journey. They crossed the Channel and went down through France by train and carriage to Marseille, and at Marseille she spent 2 days buying stores with the money she had, because she had already worked out that the army's supply arrangements could not be relied upon, and she intended to arrive with her own. Then a steamer across the Mediterranean, and a bad passage, with a gale coming down on them, and almost the whole party prostrate and sick in a crowded cabin, and their commander lying flat among them, ill herself, going through her lists. They came into the Bosphorus on the 4th of November, and lay off Constantinople in the rain, and while they waited for the boats to take them ashore, word came aboard of what had happened 3 days before at a place called Balaclava, and then, within days of their landing, the wounded of Inkerman began to arrive. She had 8 days' notice, a party of women who had never worked together, no authority anybody recognised, no supplies but what she had bought herself, and the largest hospital in the world about to be filled beyond its capacity. She was 34. Her mother and sister, at the last, were magnificent about it, and it is worth saying so. All the years of tears and scenes fell away the moment the thing became public and glorious, and Fanny and Parthy were suddenly, uncomplicatedly proud of her. The world had put its stamp on what she wanted to do, and that made it respectable, and once it was respectable, they could love it. There is something almost funny in that, and something rather sad. Picture the approach, because it is one of the great arrivals in English history, and almost nobody pictures it properly. Constantinople in November, the water of the Bosphorus grey and choppy under a low sky, the minarets and domes of the old city on one shore, and on the other, on the Asian side, standing up on the heights above the water, an enormous yellow building, the Salimier Barracks, a vast square block built round a courtyard, with a tower at each of its 4 corners. It had been lent to the British by the Turkish government to be used as a hospital. It was, at that moment, the largest hospital in the world, and it was less a hospital than a warehouse with people in it. She landed and climbed up to it and went in, and what she found in there is the reason her name is remembered. Let me be careful here, because I am not going to dwell on the horror of it, and you are not lying in the dark tonight to be harrowed. But you cannot understand what she did without knowing what she walked into, so I will tell it plainly and briefly, and then we will move on to the work, which is the part that matters. The building was immense, and there were, in the end, something like 4 miles of beds in it. The wounded lay in rows on the floors of enormous corridors, on mattresses stuffed with straw, often still in the uniforms they had been carried in from the battlefield. There was almost no furniture and almost no equipment. There were no basins, no towels, hardly any soap, few candles, no proper kitchens, no laundry worth the name. The men were washed, when they were washed at all, with a very few cloths passed from body to body. The water supply was inadequate, and the little there was ran, though nobody yet understood this, past the carcass of a dead animal in the channel that fed it. The building stood over sewers that were blocked and unventilated, and the wards drew their air up out of them. Rats and vermin were everywhere, and the sick and wounded came in by the shipload, hundreds at a time, ferried across the Black Sea for days in crowded transports, and were carried up the hill on stretchers and laid down in the corridors, and a great many of them, having survived their wounds and the voyage, were then carried off by something they caught inside it, by typhus, by cholera, by dysentery. Through that first winter, something like 10 men were lost to disease in there for everyone who died of his wounds. That is what she found. Now, let me tell you what she did, because the doing of it is the most impressive thing about her, and it was not chiefly a matter of tenderness. It was a matter of stubbornness, organisation, money, and paperwork. The first obstacle was not the filth. It was the men in charge. The senior army doctors did not want her, did not want women in a military hospital at all, regarded her appointment as an insult and an interference, and set out to freeze her out. So for the first 10 days or so, Florence Nightingale, having crossed a continent with 38 women to nurse the wounded, sat in her rooms and did almost nothing, and kept her nurses out of the wards and waited to be asked. It was the shrewdest decision she ever made. She had grasped at once that if she forced her way in, she would be thrown out within a month, and that the only way to establish herself was to be so obviously, undeniably necessary that they came to her. So she waited, and she used the waiting. She took the measure of the place, she made lists, and she sat down and wrote to Sidney Herbert. And then the wounded of Inkerman began arriving in their thousands, and the medical staff were swamped beyond any hope of coping, and they came to her, and she was ready. And what she had, and what no one else in that place had, was money, and a completely free hand with it. The readers of the Times had poured donations into a fund for the wounded, and she had the disposal of it. And she also had her own considerable means, and the willingness to spend them. So while the army supply system did what army supply systems do, which is to explain in writing why the shirts cannot be released until the board has met, Florence Nightingale simply went out and bought things. She bought shirts by the thousand. She bought socks, knives and forks, plates, cups, spoons, trays, tables, clean bedding, screens, operating tables, towels, soap, scrubbing brushes. She rented a house nearby and set up a laundry in it, staffed by soldiers' wives, so that for the first time the sheets and shirts of that hospital were properly boiled and washed. She set up her own kitchens, extra kitchens, apart from the official ones, and got food that a sick man could actually eat prepared at the hours he needed it. Broths, arrowroot, jellies, wine. She had the men's own filthy clothing taken away and burned and replaced. When the army refused to release stores from the purveyor's warehouse without the correct forms, she was known to send a party in to take them and let the paperwork catch up afterwards. And she wrote, "This is the part that never gets into the pictures. Florence Nightingale sat up half of every night in a little room off one of the corridors, writing, and the volume of it is barely believable. She sent official reports and demands to Sidney Herbert in London, hundreds of pages of them, itemised, specific, unanswerable. She drew up requisitions. She kept accounts of every penny of the Times fund. She answered the families of the dead in her own hand, night after night after night, hundreds of them, telling a mother in Nottingham or a wife in Glasgow how her boy had died and that he had spoken of her. She set up a scheme to send the men's pay home to their families, because the money had a way of evaporating otherwise, and she handled a great deal of it personally. She started reading rooms for the convalescent men, because she saw that idleness and drink were destroying them, and the officers laughed at the idea that common soldiers would want books, and the men crowded in. She worked 20 hours a day. She was seen on her feet for 8 hours at a stretch without sitting, and standing beside operating tables for hours holding men's hands, and one witness who came out with a later party wrote that she saw her, at the end of an entire day of this, sit down at last at 2 a.m. to begin her letters. And then, when the whole enormous building had gone quiet, and the surgeons had gone, and the orderlies were asleep, she walked. That is where the picture that made her immortal comes from. She took a lamp and went round the wards at night, alone, 4 miles of them, hour after hour, looking at every man. It was a Turkish lantern, by the way, not the little Greek lamp of the paintings, a folding lantern of pleated paper or fabric with a candle inside, the kind you could carry down a passage in a wind. And the soldiers, lying in the dark in that terrible building, thousands of miles from home, and mostly expecting not to see it again, watched that light coming along the wall towards them, and lay still and waited for it to reach them. Men said so in their letters home. They said they could kiss her shadow as it fell on the pillow. A dying man would be quiet if she stood by him for a moment. The Times printed the picture of her in February of 1855, and it went through England like fire. The Illustrated London News put out an image of her among the wounded with the lamp in her hand, and the country, sick with grief and rage over that winter, seized on her. She became overnight the most famous woman in the country after the Queen. Ballads were written about her. Her face, or somebody's guess at her face, since almost nobody knew what she looked like, appeared on figurines and prints and paper bags and pot lids and children's handkerchiefs. Babies were named after her. Racehorses were named after her. And out in Scutari, the woman herself, who by any account hated all of it, went on measuring the amount of arrowroot in the store. Because here is the thing that the legend gets wrong, and that she herself spent the rest of her life trying to make people understand. The lamp is the least of it. Through that first winter, the death rate in her hospital went up, not down. It rose and rose until, in February of 1855, it was the worst of any hospital in the theatre of that war. 4,077 men died in that building over the winter, and the great majority of them were lost to infectious disease, and they were killed by the building itself, by the blocked sewers under the wards, and the foul water, and the absence of any ventilation, and the sheer packing of sick men into a barracks never designed to hold them. Nothing she could buy or scrub or organise touched that, because nobody there yet understood what was killing them. And so in March of 1855, the government, prodded hard by Herbert and by the scandal at home, sent out a sanitary commission with the power to act. They went into that barracks and found the sewers choked, and the water supply fouled, and the ventilation non-existent. They flushed out the drains. They cleared the dead animal from the water channel. They lime-washed the walls, knocked openings for air, and took away cartloads of filth. And the death rate in the barrack hospital fell, over the following months, from something appalling to something ordinary. She never claimed the credit for that. On the contrary, and this is the key to the whole second half of her life, she came home believing that the men had died because of her. Let me take you inside one ordinary night in that barracks, because the famous picture of the lamp is a painting, and the reality of it was something else. And the reality is better. It is perhaps 2 a.m. in January. Outside, the wind is coming off the Black Sea, and the rain is going sideways across the great courtyard, and the roof leaks in 100 places. Inside, the corridors run away into the dark, for what seems like miles, and along both sides of them the men are lying in their rows close together, on the floor and on low beds, with a narrow lane left down the middle to walk in. There is a smell that everyone who was there tried and failed to describe. There is a constant low sound made up of several hundred men breathing badly, and coughing, and some of them talking in their sleep, and here and there one of them calling out. And down that lane comes the light. She is carrying it in her hand, a little folding Turkish lantern with a candle in it, and the light it throws is small and yellow, and does not reach far, so that what the men see is a moving glow with a woman inside it, coming slowly nearer along the wall. She is not sweeping past in a crinoline like the pictures. She is in a plain black dress with a white cap and a shawl. She is 34 years old and exhausted, and she has been on her feet since before dawn. She stops constantly. She looks at each man as she passes, and where somebody is awake, she bends down. What she does at each stop is very small. She feels a forehead. She asks a question and listens to the answer. She moves a pillow, or has a blanket brought, or writes something in the notebook she carries to be dealt with in the morning. Sometimes she does nothing at all except stand there a moment where a man can see her, and then go on, and where somebody is very near the end, she sits down on the floor beside him, and stays and holds his hand, and does not hurry, and lets him say what he needs to say, which is almost always about home. That is the whole of the legend, in fact. A tired woman with a candle, stopping. But of course it was not only that. And the men knew it was not only that. And this is why they loved her in a way that lasted the rest of their lives. It was not the lamp, it was that she had got them shirts, it was that the food came hot now and there was arrowroot at midnight for a man who could not keep anything else down. It was that she wrote to their mothers and put their pay in the post home instead of letting it vanish. It was that the officers who had always been over them were, for once, being defied on their behalf by somebody who did not care what a colonel thought. A private soldier in that army was accustomed to being treated as material, and here was a lady, a real lady, the kind of person whose carriage they would have stepped off the pavement for at home, kneeling on the floor of a filthy corridor at 2 a.m, writing down what he wanted, said to his wife. They stopped swearing when she came into the wards. That detail comes up again and again in the letters, and there is something in it more moving than any of the ballads. Thousands of soldiers, in the worst conditions of their lives, quietly deciding among themselves that the corridor should be a decent place while she was in it. There is one piece of her Scutari work I want to give you on its own, because it was the part the men themselves valued above everything, and because it is the quietest. She wrote their letters. Most of the private soldiers in that army could not write, or could not write well enough for what needed saying, and even those who could had no paper, no ink, no light, and no strength. So it fell to whoever would do it, and she did it, night after night, for hundreds of them, in a small room off the corridor with a candle, while the building slept around her. 2 kinds of letter. The first was dictated by a man who was going to live, a message home to say he was wounded but mending, that he was being looked after, that the food was better now, that they were not to fret. She took those down as they were given to her in the man's own words, including the parts that were not strictly true, because a soldier's letter home is a performance of cheerfulness, and she was not going to spoil it. The second kind she wrote after the man was dead. There were thousands of deaths in that building, and for a very large number of them, the only word the family ever received came from her hand. She made it her business to sit with dying men where she could, and to ask them what they wanted said, and to whom, and to note it down. And then she wrote to a mother in Nottingham, or a wife in Glasgow, or a father in County Cork, and she set out what had happened, and gave them the truth as far as the truth could be borne, and passed on what he had said at the end, and that he had spoken of them. Understand what that meant then. A working family whose son had gone for a soldier expected, in the ordinary way of things, to hear nothing whatever. A man went and the seasons went by, and then one day he simply did not come back, and there was no notification, no grave, no account, nothing at all. A hole in a family that never closed because it never even got a date. What she did was to give several thousand families a date, a place, a manner of dying, and a last sentence. More than one of them said afterwards that the letter was the thing that let them go on. She carried on with it after she got home too. Long after that war ended, letters arrived at her house from people who had never met her, asking whether she remembered a particular man in a particular month and what had become of him. She answered them. She had kept her registers, being who she was, and she went through them and answered, and alongside the letters there was the money, which sounds a dry sort of kindness, and was not. The men's pay in that army had a way of never getting home. There was no arrangement for a soldier to send money to his family from abroad, and what he had went on drink, or was lost, or was taken from him. Officers who knew their men assured her it was hopeless. Give a private soldier a chance to send his pay to his mother, and he will spend it on the way to the post. So she set up the arrangement herself. She had money brought in on certain days and sent home through her own channels, and she stood there and took it in and recorded it, and the men queued up. Something in the order of £70,000 went home to the wives and mothers of British soldiers that way in the space of about half a year, which was a colossal sum then, and it was money that would otherwise have gone in the canteens. She sent the figures to London and pointed out what they proved, and within a couple of years the army had set up an official money order system of its own for the same purpose. That is how she worked. Do the thing yourself, count it, publish the count, and let the count make the argument. And this is the point at which I want to correct the picture, because it has been sentimental for 150 years, and she hated the sentimental version with a passion that never cooled. Florence Nightingale did not think of herself as an angel of mercy, and she did not think that gentleness was what those men needed. She thought that what they needed was a functioning building, clean water, food that arrived, and an administration that could count. She said, in effect, that if you want to save soldiers, you do not need a saint with a lamp, you need a drain. The lamp only exists in the story because the drains had failed. Her whole life after that war was an argument against her own legend, and the country would not hear it, because the country wanted an angel, and it had made one. Come back out to the east with me once more, for the part I have not yet given you, and the part she herself cared about above all the rest, the men themselves. They came in by ship. That is the thing to hold in your mind, because it explains a great deal. The fighting was over the water in the Crimea, and the hospitals were at Scutari, and between the two lay several days of sea. So a man wounded on a Tuesday was carried down to the harbour at Balaclava, put aboard a transport with several hundred others, and spent the best part of a week at sea in the hold before anybody could properly attend to him. In the worst of that first winter, the transports arrived having lost a good many of the men who were put on board, and the survivors came off the ships in a state that broke the nerve of experienced surgeons. Then they were carried up the hill to the barracks and laid down in the corridors, and this is where she was waiting. She used to say afterwards that she wished the people at home who wept over the newspapers could have seen the thing she actually admired most, which was not anything done by the nurses, but the behaviour of the soldiers. She was, in a way nobody expected, entirely in love with the British private soldier, and she remained so for the whole of her long life. The army of that day held its rank and file to be brutes, drunken, ignorant, dishonest, in need of the lash. She arrived believing something like this herself, because everybody did, and within a month she had thrown it out. What she found was that men who were dying without complaint in a foul corridor thanked her for a cup of arrowroot, that they gave the little they had to men worse off, that they lay in silence rather than disturb one another, that when she set up her scheme for sending money home, thousands of pounds of their pay went straight to their mothers and wives, which the officers had assured her would never happen because the men would only drink it, that when she opened a reading room and put books and writing paper in it, the place filled, and the officers who had laughed came and looked and stopped laughing, that not one man of the many thousands she moved among ever spoke to her with anything but courtesy. She said the soldiers had been treated as though they had no more feeling than the stones, and that if you gave them the smallest thing to hold on to, they behaved better than their betters. She meant it, and it turned her into something the army had not seen before, a reformer who liked the men. Everything she did afterwards about barracks and diet and drink and libraries and pay came out of those months of watching them lie there and behave well, and it is why the connection between her and the army lasted so long. For decades afterwards, old soldiers wrote to her, in bad handwriting, from all over the country, and she answered them. Veterans of that war made a habit of visiting her house in South Street, hoping for nothing more than to be told she was well. When there was a fund raised for the survivors of the charge at Balaclava, she was one of the people who gave. In 1890, aged 70, she was persuaded to speak a few words into one of the new phonographs to raise money for those same veterans, and the wax cylinder survived so that her voice can still be heard, an old lady's voice, English and precise, sending her good wishes to her dear old comrades. She called them that. She was a bishop's granddaughter's daughter and a millionaire's child. And she called a lot of broken old privates her comrades, and meant it. There is one more thing to say about those months, and it belongs to the women, not to her. She had brought out 38 nurses, and more came later, and running them was, by her own admission, harder than running the hospital. They were a mixed and difficult company, Anglican sisters with strong views, Roman Catholic nuns under their own superiors and their own bishops, and a body of hired working nurses who had come for wages. Some were superb, some were unmanageable. Several had to be sent home for drinking, and one or two for making trouble of other kinds. The religious tensions were constant, since a good part of England was quite ready to believe that the whole expedition was a plot to convert dying soldiers to Rome, and she had to manage that suspicion from home while keeping peace between the sisters on the ground. She was ferociously strict with all of them, and unpopular with some of them, and she would not let them into a ward at night except in pairs, and would not let them go out alone, because she knew that the entire future of women's work in hospitals rested on there never being a breath of scandal about her nurses. She was right. Not one word of that kind was ever attached to them, and that fact, unglamorous as it is one of the reasons a respectable young woman in 1880 could tell her parents she wanted to be a nurse. The other women in that story deserve a word too, because history handed the whole of it to one name. There was Mary Seacole, the Jamaican woman of Scottish and Creole descent who came to London and offered her services and was turned down by everybody, including by Florence Nightingale's own committee, and who went out to the Crimea anyway at her own expense and set up her British hotel near Balaclava and fed and dosed and nursed the soldiers there and went up to the field with her bag. She was famous in her own time and went bankrupt and was forgotten and has come back. There were the ordinary nurses whose names nobody kept, and there were the soldiers' wives, some hundreds of them, who had been allowed to sail with the regiments and were living in the cellars of that barracks in conditions worse than the wards, and it was Florence Nightingale who found them there, and got them out, and set them up in the laundry. In May of 1855 she crossed the Black Sea at last to see the hospitals at Balaclava, in the Crimea itself, where the army was, and she rode up onto the heights above Sebastopol on a little horse, and looked out over the lines. And within days of arriving she collapsed with what they called Crimean fever, and she very nearly died of it. She was carried down to a hut on the hillside and lay there for about a fortnight, dangerously ill, her hair cut off, delirious for much of it. The news went home and the country held its breath, and when it was known that she would live there was something close to national rejoicing. She was offered a passage back to England to recover, and she refused it, and went back across the water to Scutari instead, and took up her work again, weakened for the rest of her life. Whatever the illness was, and the best modern guess is a chronic bacterial infection of a kind that recurs for decades, it never truly left her. She was 35, and she would live to be 90, and she would never again be a well woman. And while she lay in that hut, a small domestic thing happened at home that upset her more than you might expect. Athena the owl, left behind in England when she sailed, was found dead in the housekeeper's room at Lea Hurst. It had been perfectly well at dinner and hopping about the floor, and an hour later it was gone. They had it stuffed. Parthenope, who was the one who had failed to keep it alive, and who knew her sister was ill and possibly dying on the other side of Europe, sat down and made her a little book about the owl, written out and illustrated by hand, telling the story of Athena from the Acropolis to the end, and sent it to her in the Crimea to cheer her. It is a strange, sad, tender object, and it survives. That was how those two sisters loved each other, unevenly, painfully, at cross purposes, and absolutely. The war ended, and the hospitals emptied through the summer of 1856, and Florence Nightingale stayed until the last of them closed, and the last patient had gone, because she would not leave before the men did. And then she came home, and how she came home tells you everything about what she had become. She was, at that moment, the most celebrated woman in the British Empire. There were plans for her reception, bands, a warship offered to bring her back, processions, an official welcome. She declined all of it. She travelled home privately, overland, under a false name. She called herself Miss Smith, which was her mother's maiden name and her own perfectly legitimate family name, and she crossed France and the Channel unrecognised, and she arrived in London in August of 1856 and spent a night in a convent, and then took a train north to Derbyshire and walked up from the station to Lea Hurst on a summer morning and let herself into her father's house through the back door and startled the servants. The bells of the village church were rung when they found out. That was the extent of her welcome, and it was the only kind she could bear, because she did not come home in triumph. She came home in something close to despair, and this is the thing that shaped every one of the 54 years she had left. Florence Nightingale had gone through the papers and the numbers by then, and she knew what they said. And what they said was that in the hospital she had run in that first winter, thousands of British soldiers had died of preventable disease, and that a great many of them would have lived if the drains had been dug out in November instead of March. She held herself responsible. She called those men, in her private papers, her murdered men. She could not sleep for them, and rather than break under it, she took that grief and turned it into the most extraordinary second act any English life has ever had. She had a weapon that nobody expected. She was a mathematician. Come with me now into a room in London, because for the rest of this story the whole of her life happens in rooms, and one room in particular. Within a couple of years of coming home, she took a house in South Street, in Mayfair, and she went upstairs into a bedroom in it, and for the next 4 decades and more, she essentially did not come down. She had become an invalid from that Crimean illness and from something else besides, and she lived from then on almost entirely in bed or on a couch, in a large light room with a view over a garden, receiving visitors one at a time, by appointment, for a limited number of minutes, and refusing almost everybody. Historians have argued for a century about how ill she really was, and there is no settling it. The infection was real, and its effects were real, and there were periods when she genuinely could not stand. But it is also entirely clear that the invalid's room became, in her hands, a fortress and an instrument. In her bed, she could not be dragged to dinner parties. She could not be made to be charming. She could not be interrupted by callers or expected to arrange flowers or required to sit in a drawing room being pleasant for the 14,000th evening of her life. She had spent 3 decades unable to get an hour to herself. She now had, for the rest of her existence, absolute and unassailable control of her own time, and she used it as few people in history have used their time. And the work she did from that bed changed a country. Understand what she had grasped. She had come back from the East certain of one thing above all others, that the men had not died because war is terrible, but because of drains and ventilation and overcrowding and diet and the arrangement of buildings, and that all of those things are matters of design and administration, and that all of them can be measured, and that anything that can be measured can be proved, and that anything that can be proved can be forced on a government by shame. So she gathered the figures. She worked with William Farr, the greatest medical statistician in the country, and together they went through the mortality returns of the army, and what came out of it was more shocking than anything from the war itself. They demonstrated that in peacetime, in England, in ordinary barracks in Kent and London, soldiers were dying at nearly twice the rate of civilian men of the same age. Not in war. At home, in their beds, in their barracks, from tuberculosis and fevers and the conditions they were made to live in. She said, in effect, that the army might as well take 1,000 fit young men out onto Salisbury Plain every year and shoot them. And then she did the thing she is remembered for in the history of statistics, and it is the moment her mathematics and her grief came together, and it changed how the world argues. Come home with her from the East and into the first years in that London room. She has the mortality returns of the army in front of her, and she has William Farr helping her read them, and she knows what they say, and she cannot make anybody look. That is the frustration of those years. She has the truth in her hands, in columns, and the men who could act on it are ministers and generals who have been listening to soothing figures all their lives and can make a table say anything. So she stopped arguing and drew a picture. What she produced was a circle divided into 12, one wedge for each month of the war, and the length of each wedge from the centre showing how many men had died that month, so that the area of it grew with the deaths. And this is the whole point of it, she coloured the causes differently, the deaths from wounds in one shade, the deaths from other causes in another, and the deaths from the preventable infectious diseases, the fevers and the dysentery and the cholera, in a great pale blue that swamped everything else on the page. You do not need to be able to read. You do not need to follow a single figure. You look at it and you see one thing immediately, that the enormous mass of what killed the British Army in that war was not the Russians. Month after month the blue swallows the page and the little wedge of red at the centre is almost nothing, and the second half of the chart, after the Sanitary Commission had done its work, drops away to a fraction of the first, which makes the second argument for her, that it was preventable, and that they knew how, and that the proof was in their own returns. She had that printed in colour, which was expensive, and bound into her reports, and she sent it everywhere. She sent it to the Queen. She sent it to ministers and to members of Parliament and to the newspapers and to every man on the commission, and she wrote to a friend that she wanted it framed and hung in the Army Medical Board and the War Office, where they could not avoid it. It worked. It is one of the very few pieces of statistics in history that you can point to and say that a specific number of people are alive because of the way it was drawn. And it made her, incidentally, one of the founders of a whole discipline. She was elected the first woman member of the Royal Statistical Society, and later an honorary member of the American Statistical Association, and she is in the histories of the subject to this day, not for inventing the circular diagram, which she did not, but for grasping something almost nobody had grasped. That data has to be shaped for the person who has to act on it, and that a fact nobody can see is not yet a fact in the world. She went on believing, all her life, that this was religious work rather than clerical work. She thought the laws by which populations sicken and recover were as much the laws of God as anything in Scripture, and that to find them out and act on them was a form of worship. To measure was to pray, which is why the woman who never got over the men who died in her hospital spent the next 50 years in a bed, in a nightgown, checking other people's arithmetic. She got her Royal Commission on the health of the army. She could not sit on it, being a woman, so she ran it from her bed instead. She chose its chairman, which was Sidney Herbert. She briefed the witnesses. She drafted great portions of the evidence, and she wrote a private report of her own, of some 800 pages, which was circulated to the people who counted. The commission reported. 4 sub-commissions were set up to carry the reforms out, and they rebuilt barracks, put in drains and ventilation, established an army medical school and a proper system of army medical statistics. And the death rate of the British soldier at home came down and stayed down. The cost of it fell on the man who did the work in public while she did it in private, and it broke him. Sidney Herbert was not a strong man physically, and Florence Nightingale drove him as she drove herself, which is to say without mercy. She was at him constantly by post. She would not let him rest. When he began to fail, she did not believe he was truly ill, and she pushed him harder, and when the doctors told him to give up office, she pressed him in terms that were close to contemptuous, telling him that he must not abandon the work. He died in the summer of the following year, at 50. He was the best friend she had, and the ally who had made everything possible, and the only man in England who could have got her reforms through the War Office, and she had helped to work him into his grave, and she knew it. His death very nearly destroyed her. She said afterwards that she had lost the man on whom everything depended, and there is in her papers an anguish about him that she did not permit herself about anyone else. Within a few months, her other great collaborator, Arthur Hugh Clough, the poet, who was her cousin by marriage, and who had spent years doing her errands and copying her manuscripts, and being unfailingly kind to her, also died. She was left at 41, in a bed in Mayfair, without the two men who had carried her work out into the world. She went on anyway. That is the whole character of the woman. She went on anyway, and here is where she did the thing she is actually named for, and it is worth noticing that she did it almost incidentally from that same bed. While she was in the East, a public subscription had been raised in her honour, a great sum of money given by ordinary people all over Britain, soldiers included, who sent in what they could. It was called the Nightingale Fund, and it was hers to spend as she chose. In 1860 she used it to open a training school for nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. That school is the beginning of nursing as we understand it. Young women came and lived under discipline in a nurse's home, and were trained on the wards under a matron, and their conduct and their instruction were recorded, and they came out at the end of it as trained professional women with a certificate and a character and a career, and they went from there to run hospitals and to start schools of their own across Britain and America and Australia and India. It is difficult now to feel how radical that was. In the space of one working lifetime, nursing went from being a job for the poorest and least respectable women in the country to being one of the very few honourable professions a woman could enter. And the reason it happened is a bedridden woman in Mayfair who never once taught in the school she founded, and who insisted, always, that it was not hers. And in the same period she wrote the book that carried her into hundreds of thousands of ordinary houses. It is called Notes on Nursing. It appeared that same year, and it was not written for professional nurses at all. It was written, as she said, for women who have charge of the health of others, which in that century meant essentially every woman in England, since almost all illness was nursed at home by wives and mothers and daughters. It is a short, plain, extremely readable book, and it sold enormously, and it is still in print. And the striking thing about it is how little of it is medical, and how much of it is about the room. She begins with air, first and above everything, the necessity of fresh air without draughts, how to ventilate a sick room, and the wickedness of shutting a patient up in a closed, unaired space. She turns to light, and insists that sick people need not merely daylight but sunlight, and that a bed should be placed where the patient can see out of a window. She is scathing on the subject of noise, on people who whisper outside a sick person's door, which torments them, on the cruelty of waking a sleeping patient, and on rustling skirts. She takes up the food, and the folly of leaving a tray of it in front of a sick person for hours, and then shows how a patient will eat. if the thing is brought at the right moment and taken away directly after. She dwells on the enormous psychological importance of small things, of the view from the bed, of colour, of flowers in the room, of variety, of somebody bringing news of the outside world. She held that the object of nursing is to put the patient in the best condition for nature to act upon them, and that the whole art of it is observation, the trained noticing of small changes, which she believed most people did abominably. If you have ever opened a window for somebody who was ill, or moved a bed so a sick child could see the garden, or sat with someone and kept your voice steady and your movements unhurried, then you are, whether you know it or not, doing what that book taught the English-speaking world to do. Her reach went on widening from that room, and it went a very long way. She became, without ever going there, the most influential person in Britain on the health of India. She sat in her bedroom in Mayfair reading the sanitary reports of stations in Bengal and Madras, and she badgered viceroys and secretaries of state for decades about drainage and clean water and irrigation and the diseases of the villages. She was consulted on the design of hospitals all over the world, and her principles about ventilation and window space and the separation of wards were built into hospital after hospital for the next 50 years. She advised on workhouse infirmaries and helped to establish the principle that the sick poor should be nursed by trained nurses in proper infirmaries rather than left in the workhouse ward. She was consulted by the founders of the Red Cross. She published on district nursing, on midwifery, on the training of matrons, on the health of the agricultural labourer, and she did the whole of it from a bed, in a nightgown, with a writing board across her knees, in a room in South Street, where the fire was kept up and the flowers were changed, and a series of remarkable cats came and went across the papers. The cats are worth a moment, because they are the softening detail in a life that can seem very stern from outside. She adored them, and kept a great many, sometimes half a dozen at once, all named with a wonderful grandiosity after her heroes and her friends. There were cats called Bismarck and Gladstone, cats named for generals and cardinals. They sat on her correspondence. They left inky footprints across her drafts, and some of those pages survive with the marks still on them, which means that some of the most consequential documents in the history of public health in this country were written under a cat. She spoke of them in her letters with the unembarrassed tenderness people keep for animals, and she said, in one of the odder and truer remarks she ever set down, that cats have more sympathy and feeling than human beings. Meanwhile, the family she had fought for 30 years grew old around her, and the wheel turned in the way that wheels do. Parthenope married at last, at nearly 40, a widowed baronet called Sir Harry Verney of Claydon in Buckinghamshire, who was a good and serious man interested in exactly the causes Florence cared about, and who had, according to the family joke that is probably true, come courting Florence first and been passed on to the sister. It was a happy marriage, and here is one of the small mercies of the story. It healed the sisters. With a house of her own and a life of her own, Parthis stopped needing to devour her sister, and it became instead her ally and her advocate. And Claydon became a place Florence stayed for months at a time in her later years. Parthenope developed severe arthritis in her last decade, and was in great pain and was largely helpless. And Florence went to Claydon and nursed her, and they were at the very end easy with one another. Parthi died on Florence's 70th birthday. Her father died a few years before that, quite suddenly, of a fall, and it fell to Florence, of all people, to move her mother out of Embley, because the estate passed under the entail to a male cousin, and her mother, that formidable woman who had opposed her for a lifetime, lived on into extreme old age, blind and confused and gentle, and it was her difficult younger daughter who arranged her care and sat with her and saw her out. Fanny in her last years was affectionate and vague, and told visitors that she was proud of her daughter. And Florence, who had every reason for bitterness, described her mother's old age with great pity and no triumph at all. There is a piece of her later life that gets left out of every short account, and it is the one that most changed what happens in an ordinary English town, so let me give it a moment before we come to the end. Her second great campaign after the army was for the poorest sick people in the country, and it began with a death in Liverpool. A papa named Timothy Daly died in a Liverpool workhouse after being neglected in a way that got into the newspapers, and there was an inquest and a scandal, and the scandal opened a door that Florence Nightingale had been pushing at for years. Here is what a workhouse infirmary was. If you were poor and you fell ill in that century, you did not go to a hospital, because the voluntary hospitals took the deserving and the curable and turned away the chronic, the old, the incurable, and anyone likely to die on the premises and spoil the figures. You went to the workhouse, and in the workhouse the sick wards were staffed, not by nurses at all, but by other paupers, women who were inmates themselves, unpaid, untrained, frequently elderly, sometimes infirm, occasionally drunk, set to look after the helpless because they were there and cost nothing. There were wards of the dying attended by nobody who had ever been taught anything. She went at it with the method she had used on the War Office. She got a wealthy Liverpool merchant, William Rathbone, to fund an experiment. Trained nurses from her own school put into the Liverpool workhouse infirmary under a trained matron, and the results measured. She sent them a superintendent named Agnes Jones, a young woman she thought very highly of, who went into that place with a small staff and reformed it and worked herself to death doing it, dying of typhus at 35, which Florence never got over. And the experiment succeeded so plainly that it could not be argued with, and out of it came a change in the law, and out of that came, eventually, separate, proper infirmaries with trained nurses for the sick poor, all over England. That is where a good part of our hospital system comes from, not from the Crimea, from a bedroom in Mayfair and a stubborn argument about workhouses that took 20 years. And she did the same thing, in the same way, for India, a country she never saw. For 40 years she read every sanitary report that came out of it. She corresponded with viceroys before they sailed and after they arrived. She campaigned about the water of Indian villages and the drainage of Indian towns and the irrigation of the land and the health of the peasant, and she came to understand, quite early and quite unfashionably for a woman of her class and century, that the sickness of rural India was not chiefly a matter of hospitals at all, but of poverty, of land tenure, of debt, and of water. She said that the Ryot was ruined by the moneylender before he was killed by the fever. She was not always right, and she never went there. But for 4 decades the most powerful men in the government of India came to a bedroom in London before they left, and were given, by a woman who could not stand up for long, a list. And through the whole of it, from the 60s to the 90s, the nurses kept coming. Every year another set went out from St. Thomas's, and they went to run the nursing at the great hospitals of Britain, and then to Australia, to Canada, to the United States, to Germany, to India, founding schools of their own, carrying the same discipline and the same records and the same insistence that a nurse is a trained professional and not a servant. She interviewed them. She wrote to them for years afterwards, individually, hundreds of them, and kept up with their careers and their troubles and their health, and they treasured her letters like relics, and a great many of them survive. There is one further thing to be said about her, and it is the least fashionable and the most surprising of all of them. She got the science wrong, and it did not matter. Florence Nightingale believed, all her life and long after most doctors had given it up, in the miasma theory, the idea that disease arises from foul air, from the exhalations of filth and damp and overcrowding, rather than from specific living organisms passed from person to person. She resisted germ theory when it came, and she went on resisting it well past the point when Pasteur and Koch and Lister had settled the matter, and she wrote crossly about it. By the standards of the science of her own last decades, she was, on the central question, mistaken. And here is the thing. Because she believed that filth and bad air killed people, she spent 40 years forcing governments to build drains, put in ventilation, space the beds, open the windows, boil the laundry, clean the water, and get the sewage away from the wards. Every single one of those measures cuts infection, whether the mechanism is a miasma or a microbe. She was working from the wrong theory and taking exactly the right actions, and actions saved a very large number of lives and are still saving them. There is a lesson in that about the difference between being right and being useful that I have never entirely got to the bottom of, and it is a good thing to turn over slowly in the dark. There is a question people always ask about her when they hear how much she gave up, and it is worth answering properly before the evening goes much further, because the answer is not the one you expect. What did she believe? She was brought up an Unitarian, in a family that thought for itself about religion and did not much care for priests, and she went to church all her life in the ordinary Anglican way, without ever quite belonging to it. And underneath that conventional surface, she held one of the most peculiar and personal faiths of that whole religious century. She believed that God was not a being who intervened. She thought that a God who reached down and altered events in answer to prayer, curing this child, and not that one, sparing this ship and drowning the next, would be an arbitrary and rather monstrous sort of God, and she could not worship him. What she believed instead was that God had made a world that runs on laws, and that the laws are perfect and constant and discoverable, and that everything which happens, including each fever and each death in a ward, happens according to them, which meant to her something that most of her contemporaries found close to blasphemous, that if children die in a slum, God did not take them. The drains took them, and the law by which the drains took them is itself God's law, put there to be found out. So the finding out becomes the highest religious act available to a person. Discovering the law is not a distraction from worship. It is worship. Acting on the law is not merely charity. It is obedience. This is why a woman who had heard an actual voice in a garden at 17 spent the rest of her life doing arithmetic and saw absolutely no contradiction between the two. The statistics were the theology. She once described the study of the figures by which populations live and die as the study of the mind of God, and she meant that as literally as it is possible to mean anything. It also explains the terrible weight she carried out of that first winter. If the deaths were not the will of heaven, but the working of a law that could have been found and applied in time, then the men who died in her hospital were not taken. They were lost. Somebody should have known, and she was the somebody, and she had not known in time. A more conventional believer could have said that it was God's will and gone to sleep. She had shut that door herself on principle, and there was nothing on the other side of it but the arithmetic and her own responsibility. There is a great deal else in her private religious writing, most of it never published, some of it strange and mystical, some of it very modern. She thought the churches of her day had made God small. She thought women had been shut out of the service of God by men who wanted them decorative, and she wrote, in one bitter and famous line, about the church having nothing for a woman to do but embroidery and visiting the poor when it might have had her whole heart and her whole mind. She wanted, all her life, an order for Protestant women, something like the Catholic sisterhoods, where a woman could give herself to a work without having to marry it, or beg for it. In the end, she did not join an order. She built one instead, out of a hospital in Lambeth and a fund of public money, and staffed it with young women from ordinary families, and gave them a training and a wage and a career, which is a good deal more than embroidery. Come back with me for a moment to the two houses, because we left them a long way behind and they were still standing all through this, and there is something worth feeling in what became of them. Leah Hurst, up in Derbyshire, stayed in her heart to the end. She went back there whenever she could in the middle years, and she always slept better in that air, and the village went on regarding her as theirs. There is a nice thing about the Leah Hurst years after her fame. The local people did not treat her as a national monument. They came to the door about a bad leg. She went on with her cottage visiting when she was there, and knew who had died and who had married, and when she was in residence she had the village children up to the terrace and gave them tea on the grass. In the end she gave up going, because the journey became too much and because the house passed out of the family, and the last time she saw those hills she was well into her 70s and knew it was the last time. Embley she loved less and lost sooner. When her father died, the estate went, under the entail, to a male cousin, and Fanny and her daughters had no claim on it whatsoever, which is a small, sharp reminder of what the law was like for women in that century, even at the very top of society. The woman who had run that house for 50 years had to leave it, and her clever daughter, who was by then advising the government of India from a bed, had to arrange the removal and find her mother somewhere to live. She rented a house for her in Hampshire and settled her and paid for her care. And that is one of the very best things about Florence Nightingale, and I would like you to have it before we let the evening go. She never once, so far as any letter shows, threw any of it back at her mother. Not the wasted decades, not the scenes, the tears, the ruined years, the refused hospital. The sister set on her like a dog. When Fanny was old and blind and helpless, it was Florence who saw to her, tenderly and at length, and wrote about her with nothing in it but pity. There is a lesson in that somewhere about the difference between forgiving people and pretending they did no harm. She never pretended. She wrote at 50, with the anger still perfectly fresh, that women of her class were destroyed by the lives they were given, and she meant her own life, and she meant her mother's hand in it, and she looked after her anyway, to the end, without a word of reproach spoken aloud. Let me give you one more scene from the middle of her life, because it shows the private woman rather than the public one, and it is very quiet. She had a friend called Benjamin Jowett, the master of Balliol, one of the great scholars and teachers of that century, and he became, in her 50s and 60s, the person she was most easy with in the world. He came to South Street for years. He wrote her hundreds of letters. He teased her, which almost nobody dared, and he told her when he thought she was being unreasonable, which nobody else dared at all, and he sent her books, and he prayed with her, and he worried about her health, and there is a good deal of evidence that he would have married her if she had ever shown the slightest sign of wanting it, and that they both quietly understood this and let it lie. He gave her communion in her room. In her old age, when the work had thinned and the great fights were over, that friendship was the warmest thing in her life, and when he died she said the world had gone very much colder. She was not, in other words, a woman without love in her life, which the popular version tends to imply. She had loved a man enough to grieve over refusing him for years. She had a long, deep, half-acknowledged companionship with another in her later years. She had her sister, in the end, and her father's quiet loyalty, and her cousins, and an enormous scattered family of nurses who adored her. What she never had, and never wanted, was a household of her own to run, which was the single thing every person in her early life had insisted was the only possible happiness for a woman. Now into the South Street room properly, since you have been hearing about it for a while, and since it is where we will be leaving her when this evening ends. It is a first-floor bedroom in a tall, narrow London house, and it is kept very warm, and the window looks out over the trees of a garden, and beyond that toward the park. There is a bed with a good many pillows in it, and a couch by the window, and she is on one or the other, in a white cap and a shawl, propped up with a board across her knees. The room is not austere. It is comfortable and rather pretty, and full of flowers, because friends sent them constantly from the country, and she loved them, and noticed them, and thanked people for them properly. There are books everywhere, and papers in stacks, and a great many pigeonholes of correspondence. There is a fire. There is, quite often, a cat asleep on whatever she is trying to write. And through that door, one at a time, by appointment, for a strictly limited period, came the people who ran Britain. Cabinet ministers came up those stairs. Viceroys of India came before they sailed, and were sent away with lists of things to do. Generals came. Matrons came, nervous, to be interviewed and inspected and encouraged. Young nurses came, and were terrified beforehand, and found her utterly disarming, because she had a way of asking a question that made a person feel their answer was the most interesting thing she had heard that week. Nobody was permitted to stay long. Nobody was permitted to come without an appointment. And she was, by common agreement of everyone who got in, one of the most fascinating and formidable people alive. Quick, funny, extremely direct, curious about the details of your work, and quite unmoved by anything you might think of her. The famous never came to see the lady with the lamp, exactly, because she made herself remarkably difficult to sentimentalize. She refused for decades to be photographed or painted. She refused honours. When the Crimean veterans wanted to hold a great public celebration for her, she declined to appear. She would not have her image used. She turned away journalists and admirers, and the makers of commemorative crockery with a consistency that verged on the ferocious. She had seen what fame was worth in 1855, and she had decided quite early that it was a currency she would spend only where it bought a drain or a training school, and never on herself. And so the decades went by in that room, and the world outside it changed beyond recognition. She had been born when George III was still alive, and the mail went by horse. She lived through the whole of Victoria's reign, and out the other side. Railways covered the country. The telegraph reached India. Photography arrived, and the telephone, and electric light, and the motor car. Nursing, which had been a byword for squalor when she was young, became a profession that respectable families were proud to have a daughter in, and she went on lying in her bed in Mayfair, writing, into her 70s and beyond, ordering the affairs of hospitals she had never entered on continents she had never visited. The very end of it was long and quiet and gentle, and it ought to be told the same way. You may well be halfway to sleep by now, and this is the part where everything begins to soften. From about her middle 70s she began slowly to let go. The immense workload thinned out. The great correspondence dwindled. Her memory began to blur at the edges, and then more than the edges, and the fierce mathematical mind that had counted the dead of Scutari and redesigned the barracks of an empire gradually stopped being able to hold a thread. She lost her sight almost entirely in her final years, and by the end she did not know who she was, or what she had done, or that the whole world outside her window regarded her as a saint. And here is the mercy of it, and I have always found this one of the kindest endings in any life I know. Those last years were, by every account of the people who cared for her, peaceful and even happy. The anger was gone. The grief for her murdered men was gone. The lifelong self-reproach, the sense of never having done enough, all of that went, and what was left was a very old woman, blind and forgetful, sitting up in a warm bed in a room full of flowers, being read to, being talked to, pleased by small things, dozing in the afternoons. She had spent her whole life unable to rest. At the very end, she was finally, comprehensively allowed to. The honours came in that last stretch when she was past being troubled by them. The king gave her the Order of Merit in 1907, and she was the first woman ever to receive it. And when the ceremonial party came to the house, and the decoration was presented at her bedside, she was not entirely sure what was happening, and thanked them vaguely for their kindness. The city of London gave her its freedom. Telegrams came from monarchs. She was 90, and she had outlived every single person who had opposed her, and every person who had helped her, and very nearly the whole century she was formed in. She died in that room on the afternoon of the 13th of August, 1910, in her sleep, having eaten a little lunch, aged 90 years and 3 months. The offer came at once, of a state funeral, of burial in Westminster Abbey among the greatest of the nation. Her family declined it, because she had left instructions, and the instructions could not have been plainer. She wished to be carried to her grave by no more than 2 persons, without any pomp whatever, and buried in the churchyard where her people were, and she asked that no memorial be made for her beyond the plainest possible marker. So they took her home to Hampshire. They put her coffin on a train to Romsey, and at the little station it was lifted down and carried the short distance to the parish church at East Wellow, near Embley, near the garden with the tree in it. 6 sergeants of the British Army carried her, which is the one piece of ceremony she would very likely have allowed, because they were the sons and grandsons of the men she had sat with in the corridors at Scutari, and the army she had spent her life reforming had asked for the honour of bearing her. And in the churchyard there they put her into the family grave beside her mother and her father, and on the side of the tall plain stone they cut, at her own instruction, no name at all. There is no Florence Nightingale on that grave, and no lady with the lamp, and no word about the Crimea or nursing or reform. There are 2 initials and 2 dates. FN, born 1820, died 1910. That is the whole of it. On a stone in a country churchyard in Hampshire, with the grass long around it and the rooks going over. 60 years earlier, alone in a cabin on the Nile, she had set herself a question about working in obscurity and being content with it. That stone is her answer, cut in letters an inch high, and there is nothing else on it. Let me give you one more picture from the East before we leave it for good, and it is not of her at all. It is of the place at first light. By the spring of 1855 the worst was over. The commission had been and gone. The drains were open. The walls had been washed. The air moved through the wards. And the men had stopped dying at the rate that had haunted her. And on a morning in April, the sun comes up over the Asian shore and finds that enormous yellow building quiet. There are still 4 miles of beds in it. There are still men in every one of them. But the corridors have been scrubbed, and the windows that were knocked through are open, and the air coming in off the Bosphorus is clean and cold and smells of salt. There are proper tables now, and chairs, and screens between the beds. There is a smell of soap. In the kitchens the coppers are going for the morning, and there is food that a sick man can eat. And down at the laundry, the soldiers' wives are already at work in the steam with the shirts of a whole army. And in a small room off one of the corridors, a woman of 35 is asleep at last for a few hours, with her papers stacked around her and the accounts made up. That is the picture I would rather you had than the lamp. Not the moment of highest drama, but the morning afterwards, when the thing has been put right and everybody is still alive, and the ordinary work goes on. It is what all her later life was in service of. She spent 5 decades trying to make that ordinary morning happen in places she would never visit, for people she would never meet, and to a very large extent she managed it. There is one more piece to give you before we begin the descent. and it is the account of what her working days were actually like in the long London years, because a life spent in a bedroom sounds like a life of nothing, and hers was the opposite. She woke early. She was propped up and given her breakfast, and the post came in, and the post was enormous. Letters from matrons, from ministers, from India, from her old nurses, from cranks, from strangers wanting advice about a sick relative. She worked through the morning with a board across her knees, writing in a fast slanting hand, often for 4 or 5 hours together, and when she could not write she dictated to a secretary. There were papers stacked on the bed and on the floor beside it in an order that looked like chaos and was not, and she could put her hand on anything. In the afternoon came the visitors, one at a time, no more than a few in a day, each given a strictly measured interval. She prepared for them like a general. If a viceroy was coming, she had read everything on his province and had her questions written out. If a matron was coming, she knew the state of that hospital, its beds, its mortality, its difficulties with its committee. If it was one of her young nurses, she knew where the girl had trained and what her mother had died of. People came out of that room shaken, and went away and did what she had suggested. In the evening she wrote again. The lamp was lit. The cat came and sat on the letters, and so it went on, day after day, for something like 40 years, in a warm, quiet room in Mayfair, while the country outside got safer and cleaner, and did not particularly notice why. That is the true monument, and there is no statue of it. There is a statue of her in Waterloo Place, in bronze, holding a lamp, looking down toward the park, and it is a perfectly good statue, and she would have hated it. The real memorial is every hospital ward with the windows placed, so the beds get light and air. Every nurse who holds a qualification, every set of figures kept on why people die, and the plain expectation, so ordinary now that nobody remarks on it, that the sick poor should be looked after by somebody who has been taught how. And let me give you one more small ordinary thing about the London years, because it is the detail that makes the whole bedroom life real, and it is about the flowers. They arrived weekly. From Embley while it lasted, and from Claydon when Parthy was there, and from Lea Hurst, and from friends all over the country, hampers arrived at the house in South Street, packed with cut flowers and fruit from other people's gardens. Roses in June, violets in the spring, a bunch of cowslips, apples and grapes in the autumn, a branch of something in blossom, and she noticed each of them, and she wrote back about them, and they mattered to her out of all proportion. That is not sentimentality. It is entirely consistent, and it comes straight out of her own book. She had written, in the middle of a plain manual about nursing, that people who are confined to a bed suffer from having nothing to look at, that the mind of an invalid feeds on what the eye is given, that a patient will lie for hours with the same wall in front of them, and that the effect of it on the spirits is real and physical and measurable. She said that colour and variety in a sick room are not indulgences but forms of nourishment, and that a nurse who thinks flowers are a frivolity has not understood her business. And then she spent 50 years in a bed and proved her own point on herself. She, who could not go to the country, had the country brought to her in hampers, and she measured out the seasons by what came, the first violets, the roses, the autumn fruit, a spray of heather from Derbyshire that told her the moor was out. In a room where nothing else changed, the flowers were the calendar. Well, there is something very tender in that, and it is a good thing to hold as the evening runs down. The most relentless woman of that century, the one who terrified generals, the one who counted the dead until the counting turned into policy, kept herself steady through half a lifetime indoors by looking at whatever had arrived that week in a basket from somebody's garden. Can like it. And now let the evening start to draw in, because there is one last thing to say about her, and then we will let her sleep and you can follow. The world she left behind is so completely changed by the work she did that it has become almost impossible to see her achievement, which is the usual fate of successful reformers. When a thing is fixed, nobody can imagine it broken. So let me put it plainly, one last time, in the dark. When Florence Nightingale was born, a hospital was a place you went to die. Nursing was work for the desperate. No woman in Britain could take a training or hold a professional qualification. Soldiers died of dysentery in their own barracks in peacetime, at twice the civilian rate. The sick poor were tended by other paupers, and a clever girl of good family could look forward to a life of morning calls. When she died, 90 years later, nursing was a trained profession with schools on 4 continents. Hospitals were designed with light and air and space between the beds because of principles she laid down. The health of the British soldier was watched by a permanent statistical department. The workhouse infirmary was becoming a real hospital, and the argument that women could not do serious professional work had been settled in public by her. She did nearly all of it lying down. That is the thing to take with you into sleep. Not the lamp, though you may keep the lamp if you like it, and I would not take it away from anybody. But the truer picture is the woman in the bed with the writing board across her knees, and the cat asleep on the papers, doing the unglamorous, patient, arithmetical work of making a country less lethal to its own people, decade after decade, in a warm, quiet room with flowers in it, while outside the window the century went by. Now let the evening begin to close, and let all of it settle, because we have travelled a very long way tonight, from a rented villa above Florence with the bells ringing to a churchyard in Hampshire with 2 initials on a stone. Think, as you lie there and let it go, of how much of that life was spent waiting. This is the part I would like you to carry into your sleep, because it is the part that surprises people. We remember her as a woman of action, and the action, when it finally came, lasted less than 2 full years. 2 winters in a barracks. That was the whole of the famous part. Everything before it was 3 decades and more of drawing rooms and needlework and morning calls and thwarted longing, and everything after it was half a century in a bedroom. The lamp in the corridor is a candle's worth of time in a life of 90 years. And yet the waiting was not wasted, and this is what she proves. Everything she used at Scutari she had made in the waiting, the Greek and the German, the mathematics her mother thought useless, the years of reading blue books and hospital reports at a country house table, because it was the only thing she was permitted to do sitting still, the 16 years of unanswered calling that taught her a patience nobody could break, the cottages at Leahurst, the 3 months of gruel and hard beds on the Rhine. She was not given her work until she was 34. She had been getting ready for it since she was 17 without knowing what it was. There is a great comfort in that, I think, lying in the dark, that the years that feel like nothing are not necessarily nothing, that a person can be in the middle of what looks like an entirely empty stretch of life and be, without any way of knowing it, in the middle of getting ready. And there is one final small scene I want to leave you with, from the very end, and then we will let her go. In the summer of 1910, she was 90, blind, and mostly beyond understanding what was said to her, and she was being cared for in the room in South Street by nurses from her own school, which is a neat closing of a circle. The last hands to look after Florence Nightingale were trained hands, professional hands, women who had a certificate and a career and a proper wage, and there had been no such women in England when she was born. They had her propped up in the bed she had governed an empire's health from, in the warm room with the flowers and the window over the garden. She was quiet and untroubled. She did not know that the king had sent to inquire after her, or that the newspapers of several countries were holding columns open, or that the Order of Merit was in a case somewhere in that house. She ate a little at midday. In the afternoon she went to sleep, and at about 2 o'clock she stopped breathing, without any fuss at all, and that was the end of the longest and most useful English life of that century. The nurses in that room laid her out themselves. Outside in the street the traffic went by, and 3 days after that they took her down into Hampshire, as we have seen, and gave her the small plain ending she had asked for. And now, before we go down into the quiet, let me put the whole shape of it in front of you one final time, gently, the way you would lay out photographs. 90 years of life. The first 30 spent almost entirely at home, wanting work, being refused it, and slowly educating herself in secret for a job that did not exist. Then, in the space of about 18 months, everything, the German training, the London hospital, the cholera, the letter from the government, the ship, the barracks, the corridors, the lamp, and the fame that arrived like weather, and never afterwards left. Then, from 36 to 90, the long second life indoors in a bed, in one room, from which she rebuilt the sanitary arrangements of an army, founded a profession for women, taught a country how to run a hospital, and pushed at the government of India, before finally going gently out of her own mind and into a peaceful, blind, forgetful, comfortable old age in a warm room with the flowers arriving every week from the country, and 2 initials on a stone in a churchyard, which is all she would allow. I find I keep coming back, when I think of her, not to Scutari at all, but to the girl in the cold bedroom at 6 in the morning, with the candle and the shawl round her shoulders, and the hospital reports, and no earthly prospect of ever being allowed to use a word of it, because she did not know. That is what gets me. She had no way of knowing that any of it would ever be wanted. She was 30, and 13 winters had gone by since the voice in the garden, and there was not the smallest sign that anything would ever come of any of it, and she got up in the dark and did the work anyway. 4 winters later a war began, and a man sat down in London to write to the one person in England who would know what to do. So let her rest now, and let yourself go with her, and let the whole long story settle into the dark and stop needing anything from you. Let it all soften and drift. There is no more of it to follow, and no more of it to hold, and the whole 90 years can go now the way a day goes when you stop trying to keep hold of it. She had 90 years, and she spent them all on other people, and she got, at the very end, exactly the thing she had never once been able to give herself rest. No more counting, no more letters, no more figures, nothing to be put right, nothing owed to anybody, and no need at all to be useful any more. Just a warm, quiet room, and somebody kind nearby, and the long, soft afternoon coming down, which is, more or less, where you are lying at this very moment. So take that with you. There is nothing more for you to be tonight either. Whatever is unfinished will still be there, and will keep perfectly well until morning, and there is nobody who needs you before then, and the whole of the dark is yours to spend. Let your hands go loose. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the story go, and the century go, and lie there in the warm and the quiet. And let sleep come up around you the way the light comes up, the face of a stone in the desert, slowly, and without any effort at all on your part. Let the whole long life dissolve now into pictures, and let the pictures come apart as they please. The villa above Florence with the shutters open and the bells going, the lane down to the village with the walls on either side and a girl with a basket, the bare tree in the February garden, the candle in the cold bedroom at 6 in the morning, the ballroom and the plumes and the long slow curtsy, the letter that ended the 9 years. The river going south between the desert, and the sail up, and the light coming onto the stone faces before dawn. The plain house on the Rhine with the hard beds where she was happy. A small owl asleep in a pocket, a yellow barracks above grey water, and a light moving slowly along a wall. And then the last and longest picture, the one to fall asleep inside, A warm room in London, a fire, flowers on the table, a cat on the papers, and a woman propped up on pillows working quietly away at the business of making the world a little less dangerous, while outside the window a whole century goes by without her. She is at rest now, and has been for a long time, in a churchyard in Hampshire under a stone with almost nothing on it, near the garden where she was 17 and heard something nobody else could hear. And you are warm, and it is late, and not one thing is left for you to carry. Let your breathing go slow and easy without your having to arrange it. Let the day you have had, whatever kind of day it was, finish itself and go. Let the names go. They were only ever a way of keeping you company for a few hours, and they have done their work, and you are allowed to lose them now. Whatever is undone will keep. Let your hands lie open. Let the weight of you settle down into the bed, a little heavier with each breath, until the bed is holding all of it, and you are holding none of it. And if you are still faintly awake, let the last thing be this: that a life can look entirely wasted for 3 decades and turn out to have been a preparation, that the quiet stretches are not always the empty ones, and that rest, in the end, came even to the most restless woman in England, and it will come to you tonight, easily, in the warm and the dark, in your own bed, with nothing at all required of you. If these long evenings are something you would like to have more of, you are very welcome to come along, and there will be another life waiting here whenever you want one, told at this same pace. For whenever sleep is slow in arriving, it has been a real pleasure to spend this evening together, with the lamps down and the world put away, going all that distance with her and coming back again. That is everything. There is nothing else to hold to, and no more to be done. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.